Councilmember Ray.
Here.
Councilmember Clay. Here. Councilmember Robinson.
Here.
Councilmember Siemens.
Present.
Councilmember Snipper.
Here.
Councilmember Schultz.
Here.
Other council comments?
I have comments, but I don't want to go first this time.
Yeah.
Then all you have to do is sit on your hands. Councilmember Siemens.
I just wanted to let people know that Mr. Lovelace is out of the hospital. He's home. He's on oxygen and would have been with us tonight, except that he's new with the oxygen bottles, and his portable oxygen bottle is out of oxygen. So he sends his regrets.
Councilmember Robinson.
I have two things. One is a rumination on the sidewalks and the streets and the storm, after the storm, and our ticketing or citations for the sidewalk. And it's a delicate, it seems to me to be kind of a delicate balance to get people to act responsibly to clear their sidewalks. At the same time, I had a number of irritated constituents when snow was thrown their sidewalks by trucks. They wanted to see it coming through clear their sidewalks out. They had to be clear on that. I also noticed that as we were trying to clear sidewalks, we ran into some trouble with the skid steer, which doesn't do well on sidewalks, which leads me to the realization that we don't have perfect equipment for clearing large amounts of snow off sidewalks. So the balance is where we put the snow in the cars need to get by, and then once we put it on the sidewalks, how do we get it off? Whether we depend on our own gear or our own citizens. And then there's this notion of, well, we should, or we will give citations to those who don't. So it's a messy situation, both from a perspective of snow and all the complexities of getting things done. And that was what led me last week to ask about our contracting, because I know that we used some contractors to to put in extra work for clearing streets. And I also know that we don't have a good policy for how we clear sidewalks ourselves in the event that we need to. And I have a constituent who has the right kind of machine to clear sidewalks, and he was wondering why he wasn't called. And so that was the nature of my request for some guidance on how we contract, how we use outside contractors. Just in the context of all that complexity, I think it would help me and might help me explain to my constituent. And the other thing I wanted to note was we're kind of between the time when we were initially informed of how many people wanted large and small grants from the city and the time that we decide on those large and small grants. And I've been mulling over which ones. We did an initial kind of prioritization of those grants here at the council. I've kind of gone back and forth on some of them, but where I ended up a couple of days ago, over the weekend, was wondering, well, how much do we give away in grants for the private sector as a percentage of our budget? So I did a little mental math, and I came out to it being less than 1%, as far as I can tell. Somewhere south of 1% is the amount of our budget that we give back to the private sector to do things ostensibly that promote the goals in our strategic plan. And that 1% has been sort of clattering around in my mind for the last few days, and I've been thinking that maybe that's something for us to hold on to and to think about if that's an appropriate number. Of course, it's a tough budget year, but I'm still just putting that out there as maybe a marker for us to pay attention to when these grants come back, as something for us to consider. That's all.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. There have been a number of crime incidents in my ward recently, and folks have been a bit concerned about it. That's an issue of, in a sense, continual concern. There always are incidents. But in this case, there's been a bit of an upsurge, if you will, and I am in the process of scheduling a meeting with the police chief and the community to talk about this. We had a meeting before, a few months ago, I guess, maybe it's longer than that, in which the chief made a number of suggestions, and a number of the residents have taken those suggestions, but still have had incidents. So I think it's a continual concern. And it, of course, raises the issue of how to keep the police visible in the community. And this has two sides to it. Of course, one, if you have marked police cars going through the community, then the bad guys wait until the police cars leave, and then they do their thing. If you have unmarked cars go through the community, then the community doesn't know that the police have been patrolling. And I myself have observed the following phenomenon, which is that the marked police cars go through the community, but the community doesn't necessarily see them. I remember one particular Saturday in which I must have seen 3 or 4 cars go by as I was walking around the neighborhood, and at least 3/4, if not more, of the people said they never saw a police car in the neighborhood. And I was sort of, walk with me a bit, and you'll see them. So, but this is an issue that concerns people. They pay a lot in taxes and want to see that they're getting their money's worth. And then there is one other issue which has to do with follow-up. If there is an incident, if somebody breaks in the house, or as in one case, there were a group of teenagers, and one of the teenagers or more, one or more of the teenagers walked off with some stuff, you want the police to follow up. And in this case, the family provided the names of the teens, and as far as we can tell, none of those teens were followed up. So there's some of these kinds of things that will come up at the community meeting to talk with the police about. I hope we can come to some thoughts on what next steps the community can do and what next steps the police might be able to do. Thanks.
Councilmember Clapp.
Well, first I want to say that if there's anyone out there who has a foolproof plan for getting my daughter to turn in her homework that she's already completed so that she can get credit for them, I'm willing to pay big money. I just want to put that out there. And
You have my total sympathy.
do you?
One of my kids used to, we'd get it into the backpack.
Yeah.
And remind them in the
It's in the label that says, turn all this homework in today, in that folder.
And then they would forget.
Yeah. And it's my mother's birthday today, so happy 74th birthday, Mom. So I wanted to say a couple things about snow, and also about the circle at Lincoln and Elm. People have started, especially since the snow, going through it backwards a lot again. I sat over the weekend working and watched everybody, it seems, go through the circle the wrong direction. I will say one interesting thing this time is that last time in the snowstorm in December, I was out kind of shoveling it for safety's sake because it gets this sort of ice coating around it, and people were having a hard time coming around it. The little, what do you call them, skid steers, little bobcats. The bobcats came out and cleared that intersection. It was great, and they cleared the curb on the upper side where you come around from Lincoln going up to Elm, that side of that curb, which is the one that gets blocked with mud, and then you get water that goes across the street, and then it snows. They cleared that out all the way along the edge there, and then there was no water going across, so there weren't the big sheets of ice that we get in the ordinary storms. And so I think there's a lesson in that for our ordinary storm in terms of safety. I think it's worth it to put that as a hot spot, just that section of curb there at the very least, because I think it'll make the whole thing a lot safer in the snow. The other thing I want to say is about is also about clearing the sidewalks. We saw that somebody got hit on Branch Avenue walking in the street. I walked home one night along Ethan Allen from the metro station all the way to where I turned down and worked sometimes I walk into the neighborhood early, but I intentionally took Ethan Allen all the way to Elm to see what it was like. And me and some other ladies were walking along, and then you get to places where people hadn't plowed, and you're walking in the street, and it's dark, and fortunately, there was so much traffic that I was actually able to walk faster than all of the cars. Once I would pass a car, I never saw them again because I was walking home faster than they could drive, and I'm not really a fast walker. But if cars had been moving at any clip, it could have been a really unsafe place to be. And I don't want to put out a particular solution, but I do think that when we're looking at our debrief pieces and thinking about what we would do, both in a major snowstorm, but also just in ordinary snow situations, would be to look at a couple of our key arterial routes and look at the issues of clearing sidewalks there. Because once I get in and get down on Jackson or Elm or Lincoln or those streets, I'm okay. But having to walk particularly on Ethan Allen or Carroll and go out into the street where the traffic lane is really only wide enough for the car and not wide enough for the car and a pedestrian that's been pushed out into the street, especially when the snow even spills over into the gutter apron. So you're not just walking up against the curb, but you're really out there in the street. That maybe we should think about that. And I'm sure there's some different things that we could look at, but I would like to see us consider some solutions for that. And that's all I have.
Councilmember Wright.
I just wanted to say that I'm using paper copies this week as opposed to my laptop because I had an issue with my laptop, so I read at my home computer, but that's why I don't have my laptop up here. I want to make a couple of comments on snow removal. I think it sort of echoes some of what Dan and Colleen were saying, in that I think we did an amazing job during the storm, clearing the roads, and I think striking the right balance between sidewalk clearing and giving people leeway when their sidewalks got plowed under, and did much better than the other jurisdictions around us. I think one of the kind of takeaways for me is that we have to realize, like, when the storm ends and the main plowing is done, the battle with the sidewalks and all the excess snow is just beginning. And I know at that point staff are pretty fried, but I think we have to figure out a way to realize that there's really a period of a storm this size, it's probably a week, but any storm, there's some amount of additional residual, and we kind of need to plan for that in the staffing models, and maybe we're going to have people stay on overtime, because I think, Maple Avenue, which was one of those areas similar to an area that Colleen described, is just a high car traffic and pedestrian traffic street, and still today at one end of Maple Avenue down near Philadelphia, there's still piled high snow. And on Holly Avenue, we were trying to do removal, and we dumped snow onto people's front yards and crushed plants, and actually had I think used up a lot of the goodwill we generated during the storm, because we plowed one particular person kind of into their house, and then they called, and Barb knows all about this, and Daryl's been working with them now, but they called back to be plowed out so they could get out. And so the plow came back, or the front end loader came back, and then accidentally ripped the fire hydrant off. So then we had a semi-flood on Maple Avenue, which it took them a while WSSC a number of hours to get there to cut the water off. But it also generated a situation where this person's daughter, who's late teens, walked into the front yard to kind of see what was going on, close to where the fire hydrant was, and then sunk about 5 to 6 feet down into the ground because a sinkhole had developed underneath the snow. So now their retaining wall, they have a big hole in their front yard, and their retaining wall has clear space under it. And I tell that story mainly because I think probably the person, the staff with good intention was just rushing to correct the problem. And maybe the same level of oversight and thoughtfulness and focus we had during the storm didn't exist in the time after the storm. So I think we can definitely figure out a constructive way to be better at that, and it may mean that we need a different type of equipment for clearing sidewalks in some way, and we have to decide whether we want to invest in that. I know that this type of snowstorm doesn't come along that often, but I wonder if there'd be other lesser storms where we'd still want more sidewalk clearing capacity. I had a question for the city manager and city clerk. I couldn't remember when the council is supposed to get their comments back on the sidewalk, prioritization of the sidewalk work. I know it's coming up pretty soon, and we're all supposed to kind of take that list and look to see if there's any exceptions in our neighborhood that would make, and did that date already pass? And
No, I don't think it's passed. For some reason, Councilmember Wright, I'm thinking it's March 1st because there is a discussion scheduled on March 1st regarding sidewalks.
Okay. Good to know.
Does that sound right, Mayor?
And the last thing I just want to mention, some exciting news on the business front in Tacoma Park. Capital Cheesecake has agreed to come to the old Savory location. So I think it's going to be an interesting, exciting business. That might not be great for our waistlines, but will be good for another exciting place to come in Tacoma Park. And it's going to be set up with a visible kitchen down below in the lower space that people can observe them doing the baking and the working, and you can actually will be able to take cooking classes there. And then the upstairs part will remain the part where they'll serve food and the different yummy desserts that they make, cheesecake and other things as well. So that's exciting. That's, I think, due to come in April. And I think that's around the time the hardware store is supposed to open as well in April. So Knockwood will have some good new exciting businesses. And a big thanks to Roz Grigsby and the Old Town Business Association, who worked closely with the landlord to recruit and have people look at that space. So.
Councilmember Schultz.
I guess I would like to say one main thing in reference to the winter weather we've been experiencing. I think we need, all of us, to understand, and I think some of us may appreciate this more than others, and I'm speaking to the citizenry about this, is that what happened, understand this snowstorm ended 2 weeks ago, that we're still dealing with. An absolutely extraordinary weather event that isn't likely to be repeated in our lifetimes. Now, sure, as I say that, we'll have another monster storm, and everybody will say, what a fool he is. But these things happen. That's Mother Nature. And I think, all of us are looking to the opportunity to professionally sit down here and at some point in the near future, which the city is going to do, staff, and kind of do an analysis of what we did right, what we did wrong, what we should be prepared to do differently at some point, to be better prepared from an emergency preparedness point of view. We also need to understand that it's sort of like getting ready to prepare for taking the horse out of the barn, and the horse has already gone out of the barn. I mean, this storm is over with. We're not going to have another one statistically for a very long time. And so we need to sort of temper our desires to remedy all the problems that occurred with a lot of time, talk, and money for something that's not going to be happening again in all probability. So there's some lessons to be taken. I'm just worried about overreacting, being, in that respect, being overly critical of our Department of Public Works and other staff people who were overmatched by this storm, but so was every other jurisdiction in the state of Maryland, including the District of Columbia, and up and down the East Coast, overmatched, certainly in the local states, by the severity of the storm. From this, I can just speak personally, I don't think this reflects at all on the capabilities of our Department of Public Works and our staff. For most of us, the storm, once we got our street plowed and access to our cars dug out and could get our kids back into school reasonably safely, the storm was over. But it hasn't been over for the city. The city's been struggling all week to clear sidewalks and to remedy other access problems that have occurred. And it's continued to take an awful lot of time and create a lot of stress on city workers. And I just think that we need to be cognizant of that, because as you look out the door, our windows, and you still see mountains of snow. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing when you think about it, what we have been through. And I am just extraordinarily grateful that so little damage did in fact occur. That there was, I think Josh mentioned a gentleman or somebody, it was Dan's, a gentleman who had a heart attack shoveling snow. I suppose that was at least one casualty. But compared to what could have happened, Colleen makes reference to the dangers that people being forced to walk on certain key traffic streets like Ethan Allen. And the same thing in Ward 6. On New Hampshire Avenue, there are no sidewalks on good stretches of New Hampshire Avenue, at least in the sections that run along my part of Ward 6. There is a service road, but that service road is a low priority road to be cleared. It's one of the last in the priorities. And so what that means is that a lot of people were literally walking in New Hampshire Avenue, as well as University Boulevard. It was incredibly scary situation. And I think that this is a situation that I agree with Councilmember Clay, that it's something that we need to think about in terms of how to get pedestrians on some of these critical roads provide for them a better way to get around on foot in some of these places. I'm looking forward to our time when we can kind of go over some of the details of this and figure out what we can do to do a better job. But one of the ideas I have is that in these kinds of emergencies or pending emergencies, when we know we're going to get hit by a large storm, if whether or not alternate side of the street parking could not be imposed, which if you had done that in some of these residential streets, if you could have gotten the property people to park their cars all on one side of the street, access and plowing would have improved tremendously, I would think. But that's just an idea, and those are the kind of ideas we need to be talking about. So again, I want to thank the city and the guys that drove the plows and everybody else who stood behind them for the yeoman's work that they have been doing for the last 2 weeks. Thank you.
The mayor had to step out for a moment. He'll be back shortly. Are there, as far as I know, he'll do the additional agenda items and scheduling update. Adoption of minutes, I believe, is the next item. And I don't think we have any minutes yet. Thank you. Time for public comment. Is anyone who wants to comment on something that's on the agenda tonight or anything else, please step up. Give your name and the street you live on, and please keep your remarks to about 3 minutes.
My name is Barry Howard. I live on Wildwood Drive in Ward 6. And one comment for Councilmember Clay, a courier service. Anyway.
That's a good idea.
I'm the president of the New Hampshire Garden Citizens Association, and 4 weeks ago I stood before you to report on how there's a strong need and support in the New Hampshire Gardens neighborhood, for sidewalks. So tonight I'm here to reiterate that position and illustrate the point in the context of the aftermath of the recent weather events, which is on topic for this evening. So during the Big Dig, I had the opportunity to chat with every head of household on my block of Wildwood between Jackson and Holton. And while in the midst of backbreaking work of digging out their cars and their houses, I put the question of sidewalks to each one, and their response was unanimously supportive. Even the only household without children or dogs was in approval with this position. So we are not daunted by heavy snow, and we're ready to shovel sidewalks. I even went out to practice, and since I don't have a sidewalk in front of my house, I went to some of the local bus shelters and dug them out. Fred caught me doing that one day. But seriously, my neighbors recognize their utility as safe routes to schools and connectors to shopping centers close by, and a safer alternative to having people walk in the roadways. So we beg you to please consider our piece of a little land in Ward 6 as a potential pilot for new sidewalks that are ADA compliant. So thank you for your time.
Anyone else?
Good evening. I'm Jim Jarbo with the Tacoma Park Fire Department. I just want to make some comments about the storm and what's happened up on the hill there, and just take a few minutes. First off, we know it's been terrible out there. I've moved mounds and mounds of snow around my house just to have it be pushed back, but that's in my territory. But during the storm and everything, the fire department, they almost doubled their calls. They usually average maybe 8 to 10, and they were up, in the area of 15 to 20. Some days they run 20-some calls, and some days they might run 12. A lot of the calls were in the daytime, because hopefully everybody's asleep other than those people out there plowing the roads. And my hat's off to Public Works and all these other agencies out there, the police department, for helping us out, and the citizens, the ones that can get to their fire hydrants and open them up for us. And luckily, we didn't have any serious fires. But the EMS, the people falling, once they could get out on the road, and the accidents, they were all over. I mean, the radio was constantly in Montgomery County, was constantly hitting the calls right and left. But we were very fortunate. I mean, there were maybe some considered serious accidents, and some pedestrian struck and this and that. But we made it through. And I must emphasize one thing. The fire service is a combination system. And I'm sure you know this, but it's a combination system. We're very fortunate in Montgomery County, like most jurisdictions, that there are career firefighters around the clock. That means right now, if you call for the ambulance or fire truck, or I say engine, it's ready to roll out of there unless they're someplace else helping somebody else. So right now, there's a shift that came on this morning at 7 o'clock, and they go home tomorrow at 7. And we got minimum staffing for the ambulance and engine to make sure they get out if you call. Then another shift will come in tomorrow, and another shift will come in 48 hours. And this shift's on, they'll come back in 48 hours. So it is a combination system with career firefighters around the clock. Volunteers are there as well in the evenings and weekends when they're not going to school, not to working, or when they can make it to the firehouse. You know, but we had firefighters, the volunteers that stayed over all night to help out. A couple other things. Again, we want to again thank the citizens of Ramsey and Public Works for helping out with the fire hydrants. That's very important. I know a lot of y'all have been keeping an eye on the news out there all during the storms and all. We got to keep the smoke alarms going, check your batteries, make sure you have water supply and food and all that for anything. And hopefully you're right, we won't have another major snowstorm, but it could happen. It could be another major incident. So the thing is, we want to make sure that we're up on that. Excuse me. Your carbon monoxide alarms, we got to make sure we have those as well. As you might have heard, family, I think it was 8, that I guess, I don't know how they wasn't too educated on this, they were using a charcoal grill inside the house. And then 8 of them in the family had to be taken to the hospital. Of course, all of them made it through, but things happen. Let's see, just one other. Candles, please. If you use candles, take them with you or put them out as you move around the house. The fire station, as soon as they seal that roof up, then they're going to go like crazy inside to get it done. And we're looking at June to open up that new firehouse. And hopefully that you all will bring that ladder truck back to us. Okay, with that, that's it, unless you have any questions. But we thank everyone, the citizens and the mayor and council, and all agencies that helped out that too.
Thanks. Anybody else? What I'd like to do is go back for just a second. I had to leave the meeting, and I didn't get a chance to make my comments, and I want to do that real quickly, and then I'll be going home. I'm not feeling very well. I wanted to mention that I've been working with the Montgomery College Neighborhood Advisory Committee on a letter that I'm going to be sending to Montgomery County commenting on their CIP and the item for the college, and that'll be going in this week. And as we get the letter, I'll send that around to my colleagues so that you have a chance to make any comments, but do need to get that in on Wednesday. I don't know if the fire chief mentioned the Lions Club. He reminded me outside that a couple of years ago, the Lions Club had come to the city and said they'd be interested in making a donation toward an informational sign, and I know we've discussed that fairly recently. He reminded me that they had talked about at the time making a donation of up to $10,000 to help with that sign. They were thinking about what he mentioned to me tonight was if the city were to run the electrical and do the brick or whatever the hardscape that would hold the sign, that they were thinking about donating an electronic sign. Now, they're flexible on what they do, but he was reminding me of that offer, and I told him that since we had discussed it recently, I would remind us of that offer. Two other things. I don't know if anybody mentioned the hearing that Montgomery County is holding this Wednesday night, the 24th, on the proposed traffic changes on Ritchie Avenue, Geneva. And I've been hearing quite a lot from a number of people about that, and they're One of the concerns I've heard is that they think that the city initiated this and it's only the city, and it's hard to get the information on the other pieces that preceded it in the Sligo Park Hills neighborhood, so that a lot of people are thinking that it's just us. And anything we can do to get the word out that this is a lot more extensive, it's tied in with what the county was doing. And when even people who do realize that say it's very hard to get the information on the other pieces.
Mayor Williams, could I announce that the full combined traffic study is now available on our website. It includes the Sligo Park Hills and the Ritchie community.
That helps.
Mayor, does the city have a position on what they're recommending, or no?
No. And
I would also like to emphasize to my colleagues that this is an important meeting that falls outside of our normal Monday night schedule. But I think it would be very helpful for all of us to show up Wednesday evening for that hearing.
Mm-hmm.
Where is that hearing?
it's in this room at 7 o'clock on Wednesday night. And the final thing is, I just had one thought on snow, and this may not be like my other colleagues' comments on snow. I heard a little bit of talk at the Maryland Mayors Association conference last week about some jurisdictions who were considering adding some alternate side of the street parking regulations. I don't think the city currently has any of those. I've thought at times it might be helpful for the street cleaning operation to be able to let people know about moving cars. And it strikes me that there are occasions like this snowstorm when having the ability to tell people to park on one side or another. One jurisdiction just said, they arbitrarily said, everybody park on the even side. We don't care what it is now, just park on the even side. It could be to, if there's single side parking, keep on that side, and then at a certain point switch over to the other side, and it would make clearing of a lot of the snow and therefore opening up of parking spaces and a number of other issues may be a lot easier. So I think it's something that we might want to at least consider to come up with a scheme for occasions when there might be some parking restrictions that are out of the ordinary that deal with sides of the street. So I just wanted to put that on the table. And if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go home. Sorry about that.
Yeah. Hope you feel better.
Well,
Leave us in the lurch, or is someone going to take over?
Councilmember Snipper is, I'm sure, able to run the meeting.
We'll find out, won't we?
We're going to treat you like a substitute teacher.
Oh, God. I was afraid you were going to be. I guess, actually, I don't have to move.
Only if you need to use a timer.
Well, that's what I was thinking. I don't really need to use the timer, do I? All right, be nice, guys. Okay. Are we done? We should make sure we're done with the public comment period. Is there any other public comment? Seeing none, I'll close that. It's now time for the city manager's comments.
No report.
No report. Great.
You're doing great. Right?
Yeah, that was easy. We'll turn to our regular meeting. We have a second reading ordinance authorizing the installation of one or more speed humps on Sherman Avenue. This is an opportunity for public comments, and the council will vote on a second reading ordinance. Do we have any public comments on the speed bumps on Sherman Avenue? Seeing none? Okay. I guess we're ready to vote. Now, is this a roll call?
It is usually, we'll have you move in second. Someone
Right.
should move in second.
Yeah. Move and second. And did you see who? Oh, okay. It was Dan. Councilmember Robinson moved it, and Councilmember Clay seconded it. And we need a roll call. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Williams, Councilmember Wright,
Yay.
Councilmember Clay,
Hurrah.
Councilmember Robinson,
Yahoo.
Councilmember Siemens,
Aye.
Councilmember Snipper,
Aye.
Councilmember Schultz.
Aye.
That really got me off totally. I'm going to move to the consent agenda. And there, I believe you want to do it more formally. Yes, please. Councilmember Siemens.
Thank you. I did want to withdraw item 2B, the resolution regarding the city manager's employment agreement.
Yes, okay, let's move that one. Then the two remaining items. Item A was removed before today. Thank you. Can I have a motion to move the consent agenda?
Second.
Was that Councilmember Wright that moved it? Councilmember Robinson seconded. Do we need a roll call for this one because they're all resolutions? Okay. So all in favor of these two, actually I should read them. The resolution providing for an appointment to the Ethics Commission and a resolution providing for appointments to the Board of Elections. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. All opposed? You guys have it. Passes unanimously. We should come back to the resolution amending the city manager's employment agreement. Do we usually do comments first and then vote on it?
Sure, I mean, I can provide an overview. I'm not
Yeah.
going to be much more than what's in the cover sheet, but Ken Sigmund, the Assistant City Attorney, is also here. The original employment agreement between the city and myself was of an ongoing nature, but it did include language related to a goal of the working relationship being at least for 5 years. That time period passed in July of 2009. The City Attorney's Office had recommended that for the sake of clarity that any provisions in the agreement related to that 5-year time period be removed. And there were also 2 amendments that had previously been approved by the council. One was in 2007, I believe, and the other in 2009. And the City Attorney's Office recommended that those prior amendments be incorporated as well, and that an addendum be executed by the mayor on behalf of the city and by myself. Resolution.
I'll second it.
Moved by Councilmember Clay, seconded by Councilmember Schultz. Are there council comments? Terry, Councilmember Siemens.
Thank you, Councilmember Snipper, or is it Mayor Pro Tem Snipper, I guess. First of all, I'd just like to say I pulled this, and I don't want in any way to imply that I had any concern with the city manager's performance. My reason for pulling this is I was on the council when this contract was initiated, and at that time my understanding was that we were contracting with the city manager for 5 years. The language of the contract, although it does start out to say that it's on a continuing basis, it does provide a provision that prior to January 2009, the parties will meet, the parties being the city council and the city manager, and confer to decide whether this contract will be mutually extended beyond the 5th year. And that I've been on the council during that period of time. That meet and confer never took place. And it further says that this agreement may be extended during the initial 5-year period or any extensions by the mutual consent of the parties for an additional period, the duration to be jointly determined by the parties. And again, I don't think that we've had that discussion. I think it would be healthy for the community and for the council and city manager that we follow the contract and not just change the contract and do away with the initial term as was intended by the council when we contracted with the city manager. The other point that was a little bit confusing to me was the item that we don't need, that since we do annual reviews, we don't need to do the meet and confer at the 5-year mark. I think it's clear that those were 2 different intents. One was for an annual performance review, and the other was a 5-year discussion to decide on the continuation of the city manager in this position. And I think that if they were, in fact, the same thing, our city attorney at that time would not have said, would have brought that to our attention that we were doing the same thing twice. I disagree with the resolution on the table that we don't need the 5-year meet and confer because we do an annual performance review. So for that reason, I would like to table this resolution and ask that the council and the mayor schedule a time to have that discussion regarding the meet and confer to decide whether we want to continue extend the city manager's contract or if in fact we want to change that contract for the future in some other way.
Make sure I understand this. So you are just the procedural part. I understood your comment. Are you moving to table the resolution?
Again, procedurally, I'm not sure what all I can do, but I would, I think, I will vote against it, but I think that tabling it might be a better approach.
Councilmember Wright.
I had a question before I agree with Councilmember Siemens. Is there any issue that's time sensitive that would prevent us from tabling to address the issue that Terry brings up?
Not from my perspective, I would say, and I don't know if this is the time or place, that based on my discussions with the city attorney at the time this agreement was being negotiated, what Councilmember Siemens just indicated is not what the representation was made to me by the city attorney. So I do think there are different understandings of what that language was intended to convey. But in terms of your question, Councilmember Wright, I don't think it's detrimental at all if the council wishes to table it this evening.
Anything else? Councilmember Clay.
I think we should put you on a 2-year lease notice. And if you vacate the lease early, you have to pay us.
Well,
and we get to keep your deposit. You have a deposit with us, right?
Yeah, I think what was interesting, I know you're joshing, but actually, if you read the agreement, which I sent a copy out earlier today, what was explained to me at the time for the 5-year provision was that because I had family in the area and was moving from the Midwest, that there was a concern on the part of some council members at that time about how long I would stay with the city. So that the 5 years was really intended to represent, I think on both parties' part, that there was an interest in the agreement being in effect and the working relationship being in effect for some period of time. And in fact, as a sign of my good faith, I agreed to pay back all my moving expenses if I left before 2 years. So there actually was a specific provision in the agreement to that effect, because that was my sign of good faith to the city at that time.
So is that wasn't actually my question. I was just teasing you. The city attorney here, I wouldn't joke with people about their jobs right now, given what I'm going through at mine. Is the city attorney here to answer questions about this? No? You're here to answer questions about housing.
Yes, I'll be happy to.
I go back to the housing analogy, which is why I made the joke. My understanding is it's kind of like a lease. Like we had a 5-year agreement, and then after that, it kind of goes month to month. And you have a passive. Like if I don't actively tell my tenants to get out at the end of the year, then the lease automatically rolls over for a year. But in some places, if I don't tell my tenants to get out, then it automatically goes to a month-to-month agreement, depending on the. So my understanding was that, that's essentially what happened. We didn't take any action at 5 years or execute a different contract other than to change. Salaries change every year, and so it essentially rolls over, and that this language is just clarifying that. Is that right?
I mean, there's certainly no there's no legal problem with Barb continuing on without executing the addendum. She just continues under the same terms that exist now.
Well, I certainly respect Mr. Siemens, and I wasn't here when the initial one was was put forth, but there's so much work to do in the next 6 months. And my suspicion, in all honesty, is if we sit on this for a month or 2 weeks or 6 weeks, is that the outcome isn't going to be any different than what the outcome would be if we turned around and voted on it right now. So I just want to put that out there. But I understand your position too. But I don't think it'll make any difference to wait.
I think the council meeting, I understand the distinction you make, Terry, but I think the council meeting with Barb and discussing her performance is, and leaving that meeting feeling she should continue would be sufficient to satisfy the meet and confer requirement.
Anyone else want to ask any clarifying questions?
Well, yeah, just one, and that is that what this is to Terry, just to, from my understanding, and that is that you're wishing to table this because of what you feel is that the annual review was not the same thing as what's stipulated in the original contract for a meet and confer. And you think that that's a distinction with a difference, and you think that it's important that we not overlook that distinction and follow through on a actual meet and confer. Is that what you're?
Right, and that we had a contract which I thought we understood. Obviously, there's a difference of opinion on it, but that I thought it would be that it is healthier for the community to, at the end of a 5-year period, execute the step that is delineated in the contract rather than just saying, well, we don't really need to do that.
Okay, thank you. I'm willing to table the motion if that's what the majority wants, but I'm inclined to think that that it's probably more of a formality that we're going through to do this, but if that's what seems appropriate, then we can do that.
We do have Councilmember Robinson.
I'll just say briefly that I think there's a difference in the nature of a discussion between an annual review and an end of a contract. I can see the distinction. So I'm willing to go along with tabling it myself.
So we have a motion to table, and we need a second. Second. Okay, Councilmember Wright has seconded. So as I understand it, the motion is to table this, I assume, for a short period.
Until we have the discussion.
Until we have the discussion.
Of either modifying the contract to remove that stipulation or to have the meet and confer.
Right, okay.
Wait a minute. Doesn't this remove the stipulation?
It does, actually. Because that's what the resolution would do.
Yeah.
The amendment before you would remove that
That
stipulation
stipulation.
because there is language, repeated references in the agreement to it being an ongoing agreement.
Right.
So, I think it's whatever the council wishes to do, but
Okay, so it seems like it meets that threshold. All right, here's the deal.
Okay, could you clarify?
Well, Councilmember Siemens said that he wanted to table it until we either remove the threshold or we have the meet and confer. And this resolution on the table meets one of those criteria that he just put forth.
I think it'd be preferable to have the meet and confer.
So we should clarify the motion to table is until we have the meeting.
Until we have the meet and confer.
Okay. Okay. All in favor of, I guess we should have a...
Tabling is the first question.
Tabling is the first question. Do we do just a raising hand? Okay. All in favor of tabling this until we have the meet and confer, please raise your hand. We have 4 in favor. How many opposed? Okay, the motion to table carries. So we will table this until we have a chance for a meeting, and I hope the city manager and mayor can schedule this at some early date.
All right, I think that the people who voted to have the meeting get to buy the pizza.
I would suggest that that's probably it's going to be a pretty short meeting, and so maybe we can do it. We have an early meeting scheduled, a closed session meeting, I think scheduled
Next week?
first.
Next Monday.
Minutes for the function session.
Yeah, we could do, yeah, next Monday.
I wonder if we might take.
We'll be able to do it then, I assume.
Are we not going to be, isn't that the
It's the
evening?
attorney's evaluation.
Right, so my point is, I think the meeting is probably going to be at max a 10-minute meeting to meet and confer. So maybe we could try and do it at the very beginning.
Can we do it in
These are the four of you just voted to table an item when we know that there's a given outcome, and it appears that the resolution actually meets one of the criteria for it. I wouldn't make the assumption that there's going to be a 10-minute meeting on the meet and confer. I think that we should plan a regular before the council meeting meeting, because I don't want to do it twice, and I don't want it to roll into the city manager's time the city attorney's time.
Okay, it's a good suggestion.
Gilbert's going to have time with
You got to give him something to write about.
it. That's right.
Well, there's
Dogs, he's got the dog story on now.
All right. 8:30. Let's move to the work session item. We have a work session item on proposed revisions to Tacoma Park Title VI housing, specifically the landlord-tenant relations and Commission on Landlord-Tenant Affairs.
Ruben, you want them to present first?
Yeah, I was thinking we should do the present first.
Good evening. I'm Kevin Sigmund with the City Attorney's Office. This is Jared Smith, the Chair of the Landlord-Tenant Commission, and Moses Wilds from the Housing Department. And we're here to follow up on a discussion we had back in October after the Commission reported to the Council about some concerns that they have, and that sparked some concerns by the Council about landlord entry into tenants' apartments, as well as, or COLTA had asked for authority of the city to go to court to enforce COLTA subpoenas, and the Council also asked about current fines for landlord-tenant-related violations, including the entry provision and failure to comply with COLTA orders. So I provided you with that information. And I apologize, I hope you all got some documents I sent over tonight amending our proposal regarding the landlord entry requirements. This came from an idea that the housing department staff came up with after meeting with several landlords in the context of a landlord certification training class. They brought up the possible changes to the entry requirements, and the landlords were concerned that the original proposal, which was to give to require that landlords obtain the consent of their tenants before entering their units in all cases. They were concerned that that would make it very difficult to perform repairs because tenants often don't respond to the landlord's request, particularly if they're not opposed to the entry, they may ignore the request. So this revised proposal just requires that landlords give their tenants 48 hours notice whenever entering the tenant's unit for non-emergency purposes. And related to that, it's been Colta's experience that if a illegal entry situation comes up, there's often not really any damages that can be awarded. The only thing the tenant experiences is kind of an inconvenience, an invasion of privacy, which isn't consistent with the actual damages Colta can award under the statute. So the proposal includes a provision that allows the commission to award liquidated damages, an automatic award of $400 if the commission finds that the landlord entered without providing proper notice. And then the judicial enforcement of subpoenas is, I think, exactly what we discussed with the council before. It gives Colta the opportunity to ask the city to enforce the subpoenas when Colta thinks it's appropriate, and then the city still has discretion whether to do it, just so they can control legal costs.
Are there any other comments you wish to make by way of introduction?
No, that's all I have to say.
Okay. Do we have any council questions? Yes, Councilmember Robinson.
As usual, when it gets to legal language, I sort of parrot back to you what I think I'm hearing and reading, and then you correct me if I've got it right or wrong. I'd like to just make sure I understand the hearings and the subpoena one first. I know I've heard this before. I think I understand what's going on. The underlying stuff is new. Am I right? On the back of our handout. That's correct. Okay.
I think it's important to have both the blue, the orange sheet doesn't actually replace all of the blue sheet.
Right, the orange sheet's only the first comments, am I right?
Yes.
Okay. So under E, 624080E, Colta can determine if a subpoena is appropriate from the county to bring somebody in. Do I read that correctly?
No, Colta can issue its own administrative subpoenas. Currently, I guess there's some doubt as to whether Colta can go to court to enforce those subpoenas, ask for a judge to enter an order requiring compliance with the subpoena.
And so this clause empowers Colta to go to county court to bring someone in for a case once they've been subpoenaed?
Well, it empowers the city to go to court on Colta's behalf.
Okay, it empowers the city to go to court on Colta's behalf to enforce a subpoena when reasonable.
Right.
Okay, thank you. And then the first one, where we have the 48-hour thing. The most recent, the change that the most recent paper makes is that it just strikes out clause 2 of 616-140. That's the only change, am I right?
Correct.
Okay, and then what that effectively does is requires 48 hours written notice.
Correct. Yeah.
And it does not allow any entry in less than 48 hours because of that first clause. Am I right?
Right.
Unless it's an emergency. And the reason that, so that if a tenant says, my water's running, the faucet's dripping, and the landlord says, well, I can't come for 2 days because of the law, the tenant can't say, well, can't you just come tomorrow? It's not allowed under this new change. Do I have that right?
I mean, I think technically, yes. I mean, as I said last time, this hasn't been a problem in the past. I think, 99% of the time, the tenant says, I need this fixed. If the landlord says, I'm coming right away, the tenant says, okay. But the landlords at this meeting expressed the concern that if I need to get consent, then I can't schedule the work to be done.
Okay, so I think I'm following you on that one. I thought I had that right. So that's a give and a take.
I disagree with his response.
Okay, well, let me just
How
follow.
hard is that?
Let me follow
I
up.
disagree with our attorney's response.
Let me follow up on what I heard and what I think, and then you can disagree with that one. If that's the case, that the landlord can't come by striking the second one. There's no. What you said was the landlord doesn't want to be hamstrung by having to get consent. I think that's what I heard you say. The landlord doesn't want to be hamstrung by having to get consent.
Right.
So that means that this first clause implies that they don't have to get consent as long as they give 48 hours notice.
Right.
I'm not reading that part in here, and so I'm concerned that just giving 48 hours notice, because the last clause says the tenant shall not unreasonably withhold consent. So that implies that the tenant still has to give consent, and that's where I think my main source of confusion is.
Okay, well, putting aside situations under the current code where the tenant asks for repairs and the landlord comes right away, the normal requirement is the landlord gives 48 hours notice. They would put a note on the door that says, we're going to be here in 2 days in the afternoon to fix your leaky sink.
Right.
And essentially the burden's on the tenant to say that doesn't work. Please reschedule.
So that's the intent of this first clause. So that's where we're headed with, in your mind, if we strike the second clause,
Right.
we just say, I'm coming in 2 days. And if the tenant doesn't say anything, then the landlord can just come in 2
Right.
days. So then, if that's the case, then I don't see a reason to have the last sentence in the first clause, which says the tenant shall not unreasonably withhold consent to enter, because from what I'm hearing you say, they don't have to consent or not consent. The landlord's coming in 2 days.
Well, the tenant has the right to say that's not going to work. It's just we're not requiring affirmative consent.
Okay, well, maybe you needed to put a little more verbiage in that last sentence and say consent is not required, and the tenant shall not unreasonably withhold consent. You're coming over here to pivot with me.
No, what are you reading from?
It is pretty confusing because
Clause 1,
Okay.
last
fairly
sentence.
confusing because the prior one, the blue sheet, the original, did have explicit.
Well, before you rewrite it, I'd
The
like to.
tenant affirmatively must give consent to the entry, either verbally or in writing. So you did, in fact, on the previous version, prior version.
I thought this was intended to be Xed out. It's Xed out in the first version, and then there's just a single bar through it in the second one. And I thought all of this was Xed out.
The
Number is Xed out.
That's probably a word perfect or a word.
We can't X out just the one and then have the thing. It doesn't make any sense to X out the number.
Well, there's no 1 and 2, so maybe not having numbers does make sense.
it would move up to the first line there. I took out the 1 because there's no 2.
Okay, that explains it. So, that's my question. To clarify it, in my mind, to clarify that the tenant it's not required of the tenant to withhold, to consent. It's not required of the tenant to consent.
I'm saying, how we It needs to be changed, but...
Yes, all right, well, I guess
What the wording
I've said enough, and that's, then we can go on from there.
Okay, so, yeah, this is really confusing, and I guess my request would be if we're going to do this, I guess to the city clerk, if we're going to do something as complex as this, we could get the whole...
Well, the
definitely support the
document,
paper saving, but it's too confusing.
the document I gave you today stands alone.
They just said that we couldn't do this unless we follow along with all the others. And so when I'm looking at what you sent me, what I got initially, it says proposed landlord-tenant code revision. Soon I'm going to vote to table this.
Are you talking about the summary one, or which one?
With the one that's online, February 22nd, 2010 work session, 6.16.140, entry, line A, notice of intent to enter, routine entry. Landlords may enter a rental unit at any time with the consent of the tenant. The tenant affirmatively must give consent to the entry either verbally or in writing. And you have since changed that.
Yes.
And so now all we have is the landlord shall provide the tenant with at least 48 hours of written notification of the intent of the landlord or authorized person to enter the rental unit. You've removed the part which says that they have to consent verbally or in writing. The notice shall contain the date, approximate time frame of intended entry, the purpose of the intended entry, and the telephone number. The tenant shall not unreasonably withhold consent to enter. I don't understand where in this it means that the landlord and the tenant cannot mutually agree to an earlier time frame, which is, I thought, the question that Councilmember Robinson asked, and I thought that what I heard your response say was that, in fact, this would preclude that, and I don't, is that what you said, or did I misunderstand you?
No, I said, yes, that it would preclude that.
That doesn't make sense.
Doesn't make any sense at all. I see no reason why two parties couldn't agree to have mutual agreement to come over and fix a leaking faucet. Even given what you've written here.
Councilmember Clay, if I may, when last we were here, it was 140.2 that triggered much of the dialogue that has subsequently followed. Some council members did not realize that landlords could make the entry without any further notice if the tenant had asked for it, as long as that entry was made within two weeks.
Correct.
All right, now.
I also did not like that.
Right, so that's what this, I think, does address that. The latest being.
I would agree.
Okay.
It does so very well.
All right. But now the issue is, I'm a bit mixed up now. What is the question now?
Question is,
Member Robinson, can we just finish with
sure, okay. I thought I was the one who had
Well,
made the
I'm not
question.
on this issue, but, okay, so you're my tenant, and
Yeah.
I'm your landlord. And I call you and I say, I want to install a new thermostat for you to help you save energy. I'm available tomorrow. Is that okay with you? And you happen to be home tomorrow. And you say, yeah, that's fine. I interpret his response as saying that that's not legal.
Right.
Well, I'm not sure if it's a legal question, Councilmember, as much as it is a practical question. How would I document that I talked to you? I'm the tenant, right? And you're the landlord. How would you document that you talked to me and I said it's okay for me to come in?
Well, I have a good relationship with my tenants, so I don't have this problem with them. But if I had a poor relationship with them, I'd probably do it by email.
Okay, I'm not sure if it turns on whether you and your tenant are on good terms. I think it turns on being able to document what was said or what was done. And we thought that the 48-hour written notice would be very clear in saying 48-hour notice, which is, we think it is more doable than leaving it up to two parties, with one to say, I did ask, and the other to say, no, you didn't ask.
How do you document 48 hours written notice?
Well, there's the actual notice, one. There's a physical notice.
Okay, but, I could backdate my notice, and I'm not bothered to go over to College Park and post it on their door, and I could, when I went to court, I could create it before the night I got up and went to court and say, here's a photocopy of the notice that I put on their door.
But that hasn't been our basic experience here. I mean, this entry issue, as I indicated to you before, has never been a burning issue in the landlord-tenant office. It is an issue that has come up periodically. But landlords, as Mr. Sigmund indicated at the last seminar, stated that they would much prefer seeing the 48-hour written notice versus the tenant and the landlord doing something that is not documented in a writing.
Okay.
And I wasn't there, but the impression I got, what staff took away, was that this possibility of going in, the day somebody calls or the next day is not something that really happens. I mean, I was of your mindset, Councilmember Clay, that you don't want to have a mandatory notice requirement that's going to prevent things from getting done. But it sounds like things rarely get done that quickly, and the consent requirement would have made it more difficult.
Well, in all honesty, if I called you and I offered to come install a new energy efficient thermostat, and you agreed, your consent would be you'd open the door when I got there. I suppose I could make an appointment to do it while you're out, and I would use my pass key. But it just seems it's careful. It seems not. I know I'm on a roll today, aren't I? I'm insulting people right and left. It seems not to be a reasonable. I question the interpretation of it, but it doesn't seem reasonable that we would set up a system whereby the landlord and the tenant couldn't make an agreement to do it. If it was, if something came up on Friday and the landlord said, hey, I'm available on Saturday, I can come over and do it tomorrow, I don't think that our law should preclude that. So I guess I would like you to change it so that if they have by mutual consent, that I could agree to come over and install an energy efficiency thermostat, if we both agreed.
May I contribute to this conversation?
Can we close the part with Councilmember Robinson?
Okay, I would recommend that in the first clause we add the language supplementing the last sentence. Add one clause, and that clause would be: tenant consent is not required, comma, and then continue on. The tenant shall not unreasonably withhold consent to enter. Okay? So what that means is the landlord can give 48 hours notice, as I read it. The tenant consent is not required.
I object to
That's, I'm going with what the intent is. Okay. And that the tenant shall not unreasonably withhold consent to enter. And furthermore, I would put a second clause in, which reads, earlier access can be arranged by written mutual consent.
And then it would be written. If it was written, it would make the landlords happy.
May I make a suggestion, offer an idea here?
Councilmember Siemens is ahead of you.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. First of all, I'd like to say that although the Housing Department may not see this as being important, for the tenants that I hear from as a council member, it is one of the more important issues that people bring to me. And in fact, I think they're reluctant to go to the Housing Department or to really object to their landlords about this issue because they know that the landlord kind of holds a hammer over them, and they may not renew their lease, as you all are familiar with, has happened to a tenant this week who complained about this very thing. And has repeatedly complained about it, and the answer is now that they're looking for a new apartment because their landlord is not going to continue leasing to them. I think if we look at this from a perspective, I mean, I own my house, and you all may own a house, but you have a home, whether you own it or whether you rent it. And if you want the walls painted in your house, and you call and say to the painter, I'd like to have my walls painted, you don't expect the painter to show up the next morning and say, I'm here to paint your walls without having given you notice of when he can do it. Right? You're going to let me know a couple days in advance, and then you come over and paint my walls. If he called up and said, okay, I'm going to come over in 48 hours and I'm going to paint your walls, you would like the right to say, that ain't going to work for me. Could we do it maybe Thursday or, a week from now? You want to participate in that decision about when are your walls going to be painted. It's your home. Tenants are no different. It's their home. They want to participate in the decision about when is their home going to be entered and worked on. That's an optional kind of thing. It's not something that has to be done today. It isn't something that has to be done tomorrow. It's something that, let's work it out when we can do it. Okay, there's emergency things that come up. Hey, my faucet broke off, the water's spraying up in the air, and you call the plumber, and the plumber says, well, I can't get there today, but I'll get there tomorrow, right? Or they say, I'll be there in an hour, and you say, okay, that's great. Whenever you get here, that's fine. The tenant's going to feel the same way, right? It's their home. They don't want water spraying all over. So they don't want to be tied down to having to respond to a 48-hour notice. I mean, that's absurd. And then there are the things that the landlord becomes aware of that the tenant might not. The tenant's out of town on vacation, the pipe breaks, the tenant downstairs says, hey, there's water pouring down through the ceiling, right? A landlord wants to go in and find that out. I mean, that's, again, a no-brainer. Of course they can go in and do that without any kind of notice. It's an emergency situation. But we need a law that kind of gives the tenants and the landlords both some control over their own interests. And that's both of their interests, not just the landlord's interests, not just the tenant's interests. And it's really not the emergency situations that are the problem. The problems arise on the idea that the landlord or the tenant wants something done in their home, in the tenant's home, and they need to work out a mutual agreement on when they can do that. And many landlords will, work very well with the tenants, as I'm sure Councilmember Clay does. But there are those tenants that aren't real mature in the way they deal with things, and there are those landlords who are not real mature in the way they deal with things. And so we need to have a law that makes sure that both of their interests, that they're both put in a position where they can talk with each other and correspond with each other, and that our housing department, Mr. Weil and the COLTA can say, yeah, I see you guys are being fair with each other. And then there needs to be some teeth in there, so if they're not being fair with each other, that there's some punishment involved. And if they're repeatedly not giving a 48-hour notice, if it's a 48-hour notice, repeatedly not doing that, if there's no teeth in the law, then what's to keep the landlord from not going back and just not ignoring it repeatedly? So I'm glad to see that there's maybe some teeth in there, that there could be a fine involved if it is ignored. But I certainly don't want to say that the proposed change in the wording that Councilmember Robinson put in, that no, after 48 hours notice, you can come into my home and do whatever you want to. No, I mean, come on. It's, there has to be something in there for the, like I say, for the immature tenant or whatever the reasons that they repeatedly just try to block the landlord from doing work, even if they request it. I mean, that doesn't work, but you also can't go the other way and just say, absolutely not. As of 48 hours, I'm coming into your home and do whatever I want, or what the work that's requested. So I like the idea that things are in writing, and I would say that if it's in writing, then you can come to Colt and complain. If you don't have the writing, don't even bother coming. Don't even, if you're complaining and neither party's putting stuff in writing, don't come into COLDA because, I don't want to hear your complaints. If you guys aren't communicating in writing so that you can represent your, offer some evidence on your own behalf, then it's pointless to come and have a he said, she said kind of battle. So I'm not sure that this is quite there yet, but I think it's in the right direction. And I'm really glad to see you bring it forward. I appreciate your working on this and bringing it here. And I would, rather than try to draft words in legalese, I'll leave that to you all to do. But I think I've given you my opinion about what needs to be in there. Is some, understanding that home is the same for people who own the house and people who rent. It's still their home. Thank you.
Councilor Schultz?
Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to explain that the position of, I think I could speak for staff and for COLTA, and certainly my thinking is not that it's not important to protect tenants' rights from improper entry. Our point more was that we don't see these disputes coming up often, so we want to strike the right balance between protecting tenants from kind of surprise entry and making it too hard.
If you can keep landlords in some way, legally keep landlords from evicting people for bringing complaints to you, I can get the complaints to you. But until you can protect the tenant's rights to live in that place without retribution for complaining, then you're not going to hear the complaints.
We do have a retaliation provision on the books. The city's authority is limited by state law. It says we're bound by what the...
What I hear from the way you describe that is you understand the problem, that we can say there cannot be retaliation, but state law says there can be, and so it's pointless.
Well, Councilman, if I may, what the statute says is that if a tenant has filed an administrative complaint, then that's the teeth of that part of the law. Now, if a tenant is called you, if a tenant is called me, and has not filed anything, then no, they're kind of...
If a tenant has filed an administrative complaint
with
the city,
yes,
okay,
right.
For what period of time are they protected from being evicted by or for not having their lease?
The code doesn't speak in terms of the time, does it?
I think there's two answers for that question depending on the tenant status of their lease. If they're in a one-year tenancy, unfortunately, and this is counterintuitive, but they're only protected till the end of their lease.
Right.
If they're month to month, then they're essentially protected indefinitely.
For 1 month.
No. It's really, if they're in a month-to-month tenancy, there's no time limit on the retaliation prohibition.
Okay, so you're saying then that if a tenant who is in month to month complains about the landlord, and then the landlord decides not to continue to rent to that person, they can or can't do it. They can tell the tenant, give the tenant 60 days notice, and
then the tenant can go in and file a retaliation complaint. And I'm personally familiar with COLTA cases where they have found retaliation and stricken notices to vacate from landlords. So it's actually the month-to-month tenants that have better protection. Tenants that are in for a 1-year or 2-year tenancy, the landlord can say at the end of the tenancy, I need you out of here, and it's not retaliatory as a matter of law.
But under the situation where it's month to month, it's still retaliation what we can do about retaliation is very limited by the state law. So the reality is the landlord can, that clause, I mean, the person can file the retaliation complaint, but there's not a whole lot we can actually do to hold them accountable for that. Is that what I hear you saying? Which in effect means that...
For month-to-month tenants, we can protect them for what's essentially an indefinite period of time until the landlord can show they've got some legitimate independent reason. But for tenants that are in a one-year lease, essentially we can protect them till the end of their lease.
Sure, but the landlord just gets them to sign a lease, and then at the end of that lease, to get rid of them, to get rid of the tenant.
Wow, you're getting arcane now.
No, this is the issue.
To my wording, which might help the matters. Is it okay if I put those? Minor.
Yes, go ahead.
The minor change would be verbal or written consent by tenant is required, but tenant shall not unreasonably withhold consent to enter. How's that sound? Verbal or written consent of tenant is required, but the tenant shall not unreasonably withhold consent to enter.
I mean, I think that's getting back to what my initial idea was, but the feedback we're getting is that if a landlord has to wait for consent, then they just don't think they're ever going to hear back in most cases. I think it's when somebody's going to object is when people usually...
It means that in your experience, some landlords will never be able to get into the unit.
Yeah.
That's what I'm hearing
But
you
that
say.
would be if it was unreasonable.
This is the craziest discussion I've seen.
In other words, if somebody says, I need to have my duration. And the landlord says, well, I can be there in 3 days, and the tenant says, that isn't going to work. Could you come at this day, right? And then, keep saying, no, that isn't going to work, that isn't going to work. I mean, that's unreasonable. But the fact that somebody objects to the first schedule doesn't mean they're being unreasonable. It's like...
I think that the landlord's position might be, to go to Colleen's example, they want to put in this thermostat. So they give them a written notice, and then they don't hear anything. So there's not a affirmation, yes, you can come in. Right? They just don't hear anything. They could probably send notice after notice, and they wouldn't hear anything.
May I have a turn?
Frank needs a turn.
Well, you're not getting any issues clarified. Okay? This isn't a place where we're having a discussion. Everybody else is having a turn to talk, and I'm being told to wait in line. Well, these three guys down here have a conversation. With all due respect. Clearly, with this, the way this is written, emergency entry is not an issue at all. What is an issue is the routine entry, where the tenant has something that needs tending to, like getting their living room painted, because it's time to be painted, or the landlord needs to make a routine repair that he needs to do for whatever reason. Now, it seems crazy to me that two people who have a contract together, a tenant and a landlord, which is a contractual relationship, can't mutually agree to get something done that's to the mutual benefit of both of them without having to sit around and wait for 48 hours to tick by on a clock. Now, I understand what Mr. Wild, you pointed out, that the concern is, from your point, your experience, that this could result in a dispute. Somebody says, well, this person came in anyway, and where is the record to protect either party in that case? Well, why would it not be possible to have a simple form, Tacoma Park form, that a landlord has in his vehicle with him, to go, when he comes in and the person calls him and says, my sink has got a leak, and the landlord says, well, I happen to be nearby and I can take care of it right now. Would you mind, could I come over now? And the tenant says, well, gee, that would be great. Rather than saying, well, I could come by and do it, but it would be against the law, so we have to wait 2 days, and you can just let the water drip. Give the landlord a form, have the landlord take the form with them. They come to the door, tenant lets them in, signs the consent form, says, I hereby acknowledge that I've invited you in, and it's signed. It creates a piece of paper. It protects the landlord, and it protects the tenant, because there's that piece of paper. And then they go about and do their business and get it done, and it's over with. And so you don't, that seemed to me would solve the problem of documenting a routine entry. Otherwise, sure, there's, has been pointed out, that's probably going to be the exception. Most landlords aren't just standing next to their phone waiting to rush into some tenant's apartment to fix things. But I just don't think we need to be creating rules here or maintaining rules that make it more difficult rather than less difficult for people, reasonable people, to do reasonable things together. Because most people that live in, most tenants are reasonable and most landlords are reasonable, and they just want to do business and get it done in an orderly fashion. Obviously, we wouldn't have any of these rules here if it wasn't for the crazy, some landlords who are crazy and obtuse, and some tenants who are crazy and obtuse. That's why we have to have all these rules. But I think if you can do that, we can keep the paragraph in here, but allow, but go back to the language that you had in the original proposed revision that says landlords may enter a rental unit at any time with the consent of the tenant, comma, but that consent must be documented.
I believe the original language is preferable, given the discussion that council has had, because it, in essence, and particularly with the modification that Councilmember Schultz suggested, in which the landlord gets consent when they enter the apartment, or beforehand, of course, also. Because I believe that's really the issue that the renters have trouble with. Until we get our just cause eviction law changed in Montgomery County, we're going to have retaliation. I've heard from tenants about this quite a bit, and I was sorry to hear that somebody got retaliated against. My observation is that the landlord simply says, when they switch from month to a lease, then they know that they can get this tenant out at the end of the lease. So I would much prefer the original language. I like the addition that you have what is supposed to be in the notice. The second sentence in your salmon-colored sheet has the contents of the notice. I think that's a great addition, because I noticed there was nothing in there about what the notice should say. So I think that's should be added. But I agree with the other council members who've weighed in on this, that the first language is preferable.
If I could just, I guess, we'll explain to you what I'm taking away from all this. I think what we're looking for is a hybrid of the two proposals, where the default is you have to give 48 hours written notice. Right. The tenant's going to have an opportunity to say no, but the landlord doesn't have to get affirmative consent. However, if the landlord wants to do it sooner, the landlord can get written consent from the tenant and go in before 48 hours.
But also the tenant has to have the right to say no on the first go-around. If there's more than 48 hours notice, that still doesn't mean that the tenant's going to be home at that time or wants their home entered at that point in time. Just because you call and ask the painter to come paint your house doesn't mean the painter can come to your house whenever he wants to.
This is the issue is not the emergency for which you have a nice provision. Okay, this is the routine. The painting example is a good one. If I'm away on vacation for 4 days, I might want to move my furniture myself instead of having the painters move it and risk breaking something, et cetera. So I believe that 48 hours doesn't cover it. And that's why I like the idea of making sure there's affirmative consent. And the council member Schultz had a great suggestion that the consent could be obtained anytime during the 48-hour period, including at the point of the 48 hours. So that there is a written record, which I believe the landlords need. I think that's, and of course the tenants need it also. But we're going to have a written notice provision, so the tenants do get a written side of it. What we don't have on the landlord side is written consent, an opportunity for affirmative consent. I think that's what the landlords are objecting to.
And I guess what I would suggest then, because I think the concern I have about requiring affirmative consent is that that consent won't be forthcoming, not because the tenant objects to something, but because they don't get around to responding, particularly in writing. And so landlords are left unable to schedule people to do work. So, like I said, in practice, even the current code, it's not like we have a lot of problems with this. 99% of the time, somebody says, please fix this. The landlord says, I'm going to come fix it on such date, and the tenant says, okay. So I'm concerned about the affirmative consent requirement.
I understand your concern, and I thank you. I'm sorry I'm getting excited here. I understand your concern better now, and maybe it's just the way that you word it, is that the landlord must give 48 hours notice, the tenant must respond, right? Or the lack of a response is acceptance or is consent. And that's different from saying that the tenant doesn't have to consent. In other words, the tenant can't object, and then it has to be rescheduled. And then there has to be something in there about reasonableness so that the tenant can't just repeatedly say no, 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 and drive the landlord crazy, which also happens, as we know. Okay. So I agree with you on that, but I think the way you word it has to be careful.
Okay. Do you think you have enough information, or is there additional comment?
Not in this section, but other sections.
Just section 1.
Section 1. We're still working on it. Councilmember Schultz.
Thank you. I want to go back to this retaliation question so I can better understand it. You were saying that with a month-to-month lease, the commission is in a position to protect the tenant pretty much indefinitely. But what is the nature of that protection? I guess it is the landlord's exposure to some sort of fine? Is that what it is?
Well, no, the main protection for the tenant is that and the commission has done this, they can say, the landlord gives the notice to vacate, the tenant files a complaint, the commission can say, this is retaliatory, you can't evict this tenant.
And so the tenant, okay. So basically, the tenant gets to stay, and that's the outcome, just being able to stay.
Right.
Okay. And apparently that works, in your experience. on those occasions?
Yes.
Do you find that pretty much settles the matter usually in these kind of disputes once and for all, or do you have experiences where the landlord continues to kind of, for lack of a better word, harass the tenant, and you constantly have to be kind of...
We have had cases that have come back a couple times with new retaliation claims.
And also if the landlord can insist that the tenant switch to a lease. I mean, that's, if you're on a month-to-month, the landlord can insist you sign a lease. Isn't that correct?
Yes, but I guess they'd be buying themselves a guaranteed another year. I haven't seen that come up, but in theory, I guess.
But a landlord instead could be consistently rigorous in making sure that a new lease is signed every year or every 2 years, whatever the duration of the lease is, and then if someone does complain, at the end of the lease, they can kick them out and there's no real retaliatory. We don't really have any measure to deal with that because of the state law, right? And I imagine many landlords don't allow leases to come to month. They actually make sure that people renew to yearly leases, right?
I don't know the statistics on that. I mean, I know generally the city's policy has been to promote long-term leases just so that tenants, putting aside the retaliation issue, in a healthy landlord-tenant relationship, we'd prefer the tenants know they're going to be someplace for a year rather than they could get a notice to vacate and, be out of there in 2 months.
Does it make sense for us to have an ordinance that says that month-to-month can only continue for a set period of time, whereupon the landlord has to offer a tenant? In other words, sometimes somebody says, well, I don't want to renew my lease because I'm planning to move, but then they have trouble finding an accommodation, and they say to the landlord, can I stay here on a month-to-month? And the landlord says, sure. That'll give me a little time to find a new tenant, let's say. So there's mutuality on that. But since we would agree that having tenants on actual leases is better for the tenant and better for the landlord in the long run, it's healthier, would it make sense to sort of stipulate that month-to-months can't run for more than, say, 3 months or more than 6 months at the outside, at which time that, well, I'm not sure how you go from there, but in other words, to kind of motivate, incentivize, or push people into creating year-long leases?
What we have on the books now is a requirement that initial leases be offered for a year, and that they renew for 1-year periods unless the landlord gives notice of a good reason why not to continue it for a year. Why not to let something lapse. If the landlord doesn't give the notice then before the end of the tenancy, then the tenant can kind of opt into an additional 1-year lease. I'd be hesitant to try to force tenants who have become month-to-month tenants to change, because a lot of times the tenant enjoys a certain amount of freedom, which may be at their choice. And assuming they're aware of all their rights to renew their yearly tenancies, probably is by their choice.
Well, it's not something I want to take any time discussing right now, but I think it's an interesting situation, the issue. Thank you.
Any more on this topic? Great. Councilmember Wright, you had something else?
So one, just on the 6.24.080, I agree with that, putting that in. So I want to affirm that we want you to do that, that you have the power to then have the city go to court. on the specific remedies section, just because I want to make sure I understand the legalese, does this say that in each of those situations if you decide to do liquidated damages, it has to be $400, or should there be some language that says up to $400? Or what's the...
This proposal is $400. We could make it so that there's some discretion, such as
I just think
punitive damages up to...
Yeah, I think it would be good for you guys to have some discretion around, because you could also get into a funny situation where a tenant or a landlord tries to game the system to start getting these payments by creating these rulings, right? And so I think it just gives you more leeway to say, we have the power to do it up to this, but we don't have to. And then the last thing is just in your section 3 of the memo that you gave us to kind of brief us is about the amount of the maximum fine. I just wanted to clarify that I understood this. So right now the maximum fine is $500, and that's even after the doubling. Is that correct? Or could you give a fine of $500 and it could double to $1,000?
It could double to $1,000.
So we're sort of at the maximum level allowable by these the following fines that are permitted,
But
right?
in theory, we could make the failure to comply with court order $1,000 fine for the first violation.
But we can't make it go higher than that because of the state law. Is that basically?
Right.
I mean, I would be open to giving Colton discretion, because I heard last time that actually the fine is not that big in terms of, it might not incentivize the landlord to act, right? So I would be in favor of giving Colton the power to give a fine up to $1,000, whatever the maximum is allowable by state law, to begin with. I know you didn't codify this in writing this time in any sort of specific change.
These are the municipal infraction fines.
Right.
These aren't COLTA imposed fines.
Right, but aren't you saying we can't go higher than the municipal infraction? Could COLTA have a higher fine?
My point in describing these was the council had just wanted to know. I think the issue on the table was enforcement of COLTA orders and other landlord-tenant laws, and the city does that through prosecuting municipal infractions.
Right, so my question is that the Class C, B, A, and AA, those are set by the state though, right? We can't decide to make them higher if we wanted to on our own, or could we?
We can make them higher. The $1,000 is the state limit on municipal infraction fines, but we could make everything $1,000 fine. Whether the courts would adhere to that, because I think what they do in practice is they often end up knocking down the fines even that we're asking for.
Right.
So
I guess what I'm hearing you say is that the maximum fine that COLTA could issue is a $1,000 fine. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
So I think that you should have the power to give them that $1,000 fine right off the bat if you deem that it's a egregious situation, or
so $1,000 in punitive damages if there's an improper entry.
Right.
I think the wording you might want to use is not to exceed, and then that gives you the ability to do anything you want below that.
Does that mean you cannot double? Suppose you made it, suppose the fine was $800. Would that mean you could not double it if there were a second offense?
Right, well, again, the rule on doubling fines comes from, that's the code on municipal infractions. But I would be hesitant to recommend that the council give COLTA the authority to impose more than a $1,000 fine.
Right, that was kind of what I was going with the question. Well, this is, in a sense, a separate, the size of the fines is a separate issue from the one we're dealing with here.
No, it is, but it is something that we talked about last time, and they came here and said, if we wish to increase these offenses, we compare appropriate ordinance, and since they're going to come back to us with language, I think rewritten language against, related to the entry, which is more in line with what Mr. Sigmund outlined, I thought it might make sense also to give some direction about whether we want the fine to be higher or not. And I think last time I left feeling when we had this discussion that some of the issue with enforcement is the fact that the fine is relatively small to a landlord. It doesn't cause the landlord, in my opinion, enough pain, particularly for those landlords, and Ruben, I think you have a number of them, who continuously don't follow the COLTA orders, or not just on entry, but other issues as well. So my guidance would just be that we should try and increase the fine. And my understanding is we can't give COLTA the authority to issue a fine over $1,000 because that would be in violation of the state's cap on the municipal infraction, yes or no?
Again, they're apples and oranges, but I would be concerned about us giving COLTA authority to impose a fine of that amount.
Why?
Because of the cap on the municipal infraction.
Because in the court of law, the landlord would come back and say, this is not allowed because of the cap.
Yeah, right, that would be my concern. If you all, if the council would like to allow COLTA impose larger fines, I can take a closer look at that issue. That's not something I contemplated coming in.
Well, it would be helpful to know if that municipal infraction limits us on the COLTA side as well, because I think maybe the $1,000 fine isn't high enough.
Is there a failure to comply with any COLTA order you're talking about? Is that, I'm sorry, are you saying that you want to see the fines increase for the failure to comply with any COLTA order, or?
Yeah. I mean, if you take situations where a tenant files a complaint because the repair is not being made, right? And the landlord doesn't do it, then you give them a $500 fine, right? And then...
Well, not necessarily. The tenant might get a rent rebate as part of the COLTA order, whereby the tenant could then withhold the rent up until that amount of the order is satisfied. So are you suggesting that you want us to add on to that a separate fine?
I think that if we still have landlords that continue to not resolve the maintenance issues in their properties, then they're not feeling enough pain to resolve the issue. And if you increase the fine at some point, the pain will be too great, and they'll actually give good service to their tenants, or they'll get out of the business of being landlords in Tacoma Park.
Right, and I think our experience has been, we've only had a few landlords that have been like that, but those few have chosen the second option. They've chosen to get out of the business. They never satisfy the COLTA order. You know, they get out of the business, the building is then run down, the building, whatever. But that's what has been our basic experience with those few, 1 or 2, less than 5 landlords who fail to comply. So there's nothing that we have that can test your theory that the increase in the pain is going to create an increased response. Maybe it will. I mean, I don't know.
the liquidated damages clause was an idea that we came up with in response to the concern that there's not enough teeth to the landlord entry provision. The fines were brought up in the context of what can we do if somebody doesn't comply with the COLTA order. We can issue a municipal infraction citation, and the court will impose, or the city will impose, and if we have to go to court, the court will impose the fine. I'd be hesitant to have COLTA begin issuing fines, particularly of high amounts, because I think we'd see a lot more complaints when tenants think they're going to make $1,000 than when they think they're going to get their sink fixed.
I'm going to recommend that we close this discussion. It is about, after 9:30, we have several people in the audience who are waiting for us to move on, and I would suggest that if we want to, that we bring the discussion about fines back to another time, and that we provide proper notice, and people could come in and talk about it. I'm sure that there are people on both sides who would like to talk about it, and I think I would like to have more time to get more information, essentially, instead of, for me at this point, since I didn't consider it as much as Councilmember Wright did, it would be an on-the-fly discussion, and I would like to engage it better. So I'm going to ask that if we could move on, I'd be grateful.
I think that's an excellent idea. Do you have everything you need on the ones we've discussed so far?
Yes, just to make sure I understand, essentially, the council is interested in a hybrid of the two proposals regarding routine entries by landlords. You're supportive of the subpoena authority, and as to the COLTA remedies for improper entry, you would like to allow COLTA award punitive damages of up to $1,000.
I think on that last point, we're not all in agreement, and Councilmember Clay said, let's come back to that one at a later time.
I think we're in agreement in the up to part, however.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very much.
That's Tim, but I thought you meant the fines for municipal infractions, not this punitive damages issue.
I did mean the fines for municipal infractions.
I agree. I think we need a separate discussion with notice.
Are we adjourned for the break?
I think we should take a short break, yes.
Thank you.
We're now moving into our work session. And we're going to have a presentation of the Health Indicators Report by CHEER. I love that name, Community Health and Empowerment Through Education and Research. And go ahead.
Hi, my name is Bruce Baker. I'm with CHEER, Community Health and Empowerment Through Education and Research. Thank you. We were known as the Silver Springs Tacoma Park Community Indicators Project, but changed our name. Cheerio. Joining me at the table tonight is, just to my right, is Ahmed Elmi, who's the chairman of the Somali American Community Association. And next to him is Joanne Wu, who is a naturopathic physician and practitioner of Chinese medicine. She's all of these individuals participated in our health indicators research process. To her right is Ron Wiley, who is the executive director of Adventist Community Services, and to his right is Andrea Hall Bell, who is the director of the Judy Center at Rolling Terrace Elementary School. And to the far right is also one of our participants and CHEER board members, Kathy Porter. and we're all happy to be here. I also want to mention... she's on the board of CHEER, and she was one of the participants. She also helped us run the health indicators selection process, which is what we are here to talk about this evening. I also want to mention that we have a couple of members in the audience, members of our board, of the CHEER board, Tababu Asifa and Naveed Nasser, who are here showing their support for our program and our process. In the summer and fall of 2009, CHEER convened a representative group of residents and healthcare providers and other healthcare stakeholders in the community to conduct a process through 4 meetings, 4 2-hour sessions, in which we formulated a vision, set goals, and selected indicators to measure the improvement of health of Tacoma Park residents, and also covered and also Long Branch, the Long Branch community as well. We have, through the deliberations of the process, we have provided for you in the form of a report, which you have with you now, that are part of was in the agenda, and we are. I'm not going to go through the report at all. What I would like to do now is to turn the time over to our participants to discuss the process a bit, and then we'll be happy to answer whatever questions you have. So I think by the order, I was going to have Ron, would you like to start first?
I'm tempted to say good evening, more tempted to say good night, but I'll restrain myself. I want to commend Councilwoman Clay in terms of her humanitarian gesture in terminating that other discussion.
She may terminate this one, too.
Well, it may not be a bad idea. And if she doesn't, you can. The fact is that I'd like you to note with me something that I think is more than a mere happenstance. And that is that on this very day, when we're bringing you this health report, the President of the United States is unveiling his very own health proposal. Now, how could that happen? Well, I think he called Bruce Baker and found out that we were presenting this, and he wanted to get in on some of the national press with all of this. So the bottom line is that I think it confirms that Tacoma Park is in lockstep with the national priorities. Let me just say I was happy to participate, and Adventist Community Services was happy to provide a bilingual translator, almost a transgressor, translator that could help our Spanish-speaking friends from Case of both contribute their comments and understand the other comments. Secondly, I want to commend both Bruce and Kathy for what they've done. I think it was a good process. I had the opportunity to serve on the steering committee, and I was impressed with the intentional and systematic effort to make that work group be balanced, to be diversified, and to be inclusive. And just as an example of what I call balance, is that a lot of discussions about health care focuses almost exclusively on the physical aspects and doesn't always mention the behavioral or the mental, which is a very, very important part of the whole thing. And I was happy to see that there was that kind of discussion. The other thing is that I felt that everybody's comments got equal attention. They were nurtured through, ideas weren't prematurely thrown out, but discussed to some meaningful conclusions, I think. And this is a really tremendous needs assessment for people like me, for us, who want to do some health initiatives. It gives us some local good data, and already, because of the people that I've met there, I'm putting together some work groups to follow through and have begun partnership discussions based on this document with the University of Maryland Medical School and with the National Institutes of Health. And so I think there's some good things ahead for us in this, and I hope that after you read this, that you'll join us in seeing this not as the end of the process, but as the beginning of some meaningful results from the process. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then I'd like to turn to Dr. Wu for her comments.
I just have a couple of comments to make, and my world's kind of small. I'm a clinician, see patients, and just from that perspective, this whole process, this whole idea of assessing basically the health of the community is great. You need to do that on a patient basis before you go jumping into a treatment plan. You need to figure out what's going on. And I was pretty impressed that this whole process, formulating and developing the indicators, present a pretty good blueprint for assessing what's going on. And then you can take the next step of, well, what's the treatment plan going to be, or what's the plan going to be from here? The other thing I liked about it is that, time and time again, we mentioned we need to get specific to Tacoma Park, which, from a patient basis, is also pretty important. Rather than take study data showing that this medication works for 80% of people, you have to ask, or I have to ask, what does this person sitting in front of me need? It doesn't matter what 80% of people, what that works for them. It matters what this person needs. So this whole project is about what this community specifically needs, kind of treating the Tacoma Park community as an individual, as a patient, if you will. So that's my 2 cents. That's why I like the process. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I'd like to call on Dr. Mr. Ahmed Elmi.
First of all, thank you for giving us the opportunity to take some of your busy time to come in and share with you what we've been doing the last several months. And we've done, we spent a considerable amount of time, not just in the meetings, but also in the background, and to make sure that, this project succeeds. And this was our time. We took time away from our families, our dogs, and our cats as well. So it was really, we were committed to do this, in other words. And because we believe in the fact that, knowing what's going on in Tacoma Park is essential to all of us. It's one thing to know the national trend or regional data, but it's nothing like knowing what is going on in, Long Branch or any other parts in Tacoma Park. So, and for that reason, we feel like it has a potential to not only identify and problems, but also come up with the solutions. It also allows us, give us opportunity to establish a meaningful partnership and galvanize the community and attract some resources in funding or something like that in the future. I have personally been involved in community health projects, assessments in different localities in the past, and as well as the youth development assets. And I've seen how it grew or mushroomed from a small group of community members coming together, coming up with ideas, getting partnership from the universities, which is something we're planning to do in terms of going after the public health programs at the University of Maryland that Ron mentioned, or even George Washington universities, where students would be able to do some projects as their master's thesis, or to look into this and help us around and how we can achieve these things. So I truly feel that it's something that may not be so relevant to you right now, but I believe that especially in times of funding and all these other issues going in the community. But it's something that will bring and identify the issues we have in this community and come up with some meaningful solutions to that. So, I just would like you guys to take a look at it and give it an opportunity to consider it. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrea, would you like to?
Yeah, our role at the Judy Center, and I'm not sure if you all are familiar with the Judy Center. We're the Judy P. Hoyer Center, one of 24 centers throughout the state of Maryland, with the original idea of Judy P. Hoyer that children would have comprehensive services before they enter school. And we serve children birth through age 5. What was great about this program is that one of the key components is health education and health-related services. And we tend to get families in that we refer to dental care, mental health service, and the services in the Tacoma Park / Long Branch area where Roland Terrace is located tend to be very limited. It's a walk-in community for a lot of our parents. The families that we tend to see at our school, and especially who access the Judy Center, tend to be underserved families. They are minority families, bilingual families, and less access to resources or less educated to access resources. So we see our families in our pre-K and our Head Start programs, which are, the guidelines are usually on the poverty level. So when we send families to services, it's usually free or reduced, and it tends to be limited in our community. We'd use a lot of partnership to keep our agency and keep the programs going, such as Maryland Community Cooperative Extension. And one of the things that they would do is come educate our families on healthy eating lifestyles. But then we send them out, and there's only one major grocery store now in our community, Giant. We've lost Safeway. So when we're sending our families, use your coupons, go to this, walk. It's often, we did a lot of things on safe walk-in. We have a program every year. So we're encouraging families to do things which there's limited access in that side of, I call it the other side of Tacoma Park. We have the Tacoma Park, the Long Branch Community Center. That tends to mainly, our seniors can access it, but we're talking about young mothers with infants that were, accessed into services at the library, at the, at the grocery store, or things in the community. We did just get the Mary Center, which serve pregnant moms, but we want access. Our families are asking for access to services and mental health, dental, and when Bruce came in, he had the opportunity to talk to several of our parents, are mostly moms, mostly Spanish-speaking moms, who kind of told their stories on the things that they couldn't access, the services that they needed. It would be great to have a farmer's market on that side of town when we know it's on the other side, when I personally know it's on the other side of Tacoma Park, but our families don't have that, so they don't know, they can't, it's a longer walk to walk on this side if you're driving, and a lot of them are apartment living communities, but we are educating them on this is where you should buy. If you go to the farmer's market and buy, it's less expensive and you're saving money. If we tell you how to make a healthy salsa recipe, because they're faced with the same thing the larger population is faced with, obesity, early childhood diseases, and one of our goals is to have everyone have equal access when they enter school in kindergarten to all the assessment and all the things we do in our rigorous schools community to educate all our children to be successful citizens. And one of the things that we know that makes a huge difference is health. Health is the key to success in education.
Thank you. Now, Kathy, do you have any things you'd like to add?
I'd just like to make a couple of points. First of all, I'm really glad to be back here. About, a year ago, we were talking about the housing indicators report, and the second step that we've decided to take is to look at health issues, primarily because people kept telling us that this was such an important issue in the community. We used the same process we did with the housing indicators, as Bruce said at the beginning. We pulled together a group of people who were representative of all aspects of the community. And as Ron mentioned, we did, Adventist Community Services did provide a translator for the people who were predominantly Spanish-speaking so they could participate in the discussion. So we used the same process. And I have to say that in many ways, this the health indicators process was even more of a challenge. There were very deep-seated needs within the community that came out in the discussion. But we found that the data, at least the data that applies to the local level, is even scarcer than it is in the housing area. And so I think for the health indicators, a big part of the challenge is just going to be getting good data on our community specifically. But the depth of the concern and the depth of the feeling that came out through the discussion process made it really clear that this is something that we have to keep moving on. And so we may be coming back to you at some point asking about partnerships for ways that we can get some of this additional data from the Tacoma Park community. And I know that the council has had some discussion about health indicators before, about health issues before, around Washington Adventist Hospital. But when we started getting involved in this process, it became clear that institutional-based medical issues were only a very, very small part of the great variety of health issues that are present in the Tacoma Park Long Branch community. And you've heard, this has just been a sampling of the things that people brought up in the discussion, and you'll see them alluded to in the report. But there are a lot of issues that come up in the health-related area, and many of them affect very directly other aspects of life in the Tacoma Park community. Issues like, availability of parks, availability of places for children to play outside. Those kinds of things came up in this discussion. So it ended up being a very wide-ranging discussion, and one I think that there's a great deal for us still to do and information for us to bring out. So I'm very glad that we could have this time and welcome your questions.
Do you have questions on the council? I'll start on this side.
Yes, thanks. I guess one of the first questions is, as Ron pointed out, this is kind of a beginning rather than a conclusion to anything. And obviously, now that you've kind of identified the indicators that you think that you are the key ones to go after, the next step, I guess, is to actually get the data, which you said, Kathy, is scarce to find. Does that mean, do you think, then, that at some point we may be thinking about recourse to actually going out and generating some of our own raw data, say, going into the schools and getting the weight of the children, height, weight, age for the children? I mean, with something as simple as that, which isn't really simple, but I'm just saying simple in description, the kind of raw data that you would need if you're going to address the obesity indicator.
I think you put your finger on the kind of thing that we are going to have to do to get the data that we're looking for. Not necessarily heights and weights of children in school, but, for example, one of the things our panel brought up repeatedly was, do people in our community know where they can get information, health-related information? And we don't really have a good answer to that. The people that were in the working group certainly identified that as a problematic issue. But I think you're exactly right. We are going to have to go and collect some of this data ourselves.
Because Dr. Wu was saying, Tacoma Park is sort of the metaphorical patient. And then that means we really have to kind of put the stethoscope on Tacoma Park Long Branch. And a lot of the data that's out there is large area data, or it's samples when being done under professional peer review work or census or whatever is out there. But Tacoma Park is such a small piece of geography that it would seem like having to generate, just picking on childhood obesity again, which is clearly a national problem and a national issue thanks to our First Lady. It'd be a fabulous thing if we could come up with that kind of data and just say, well, in Tacoma Park, this is actually the way it is at this particular point, and then 5 years or 10 years, and when another assessment's done, we've got a baseline to say it's changed.
Could I just respond?
Please, yes, please do.
I personally think that doing the methodology to get that data is really a very fundamental thing. But I'd have to say, I think we need to be doing some other things concurrently. I think there needs to be, I think there's some clear deficits that we should be addressing in terms of resources being brought to bear. I wouldn't want to see this evolve into one of these, I want to be scientific, okay? I want the methodology to be good in getting that data, but I don't want to wait for heaven. I don't want to wait for perfection on that. I want to get going on some other things concurrently. And I don't think that, I hope I'm not advocating impulsiveness.
That's what you do in medicine. You treat presumptively sometimes.
Yeah,
You do
let's
something.
be a little presumptive.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. This is neat stuff, but I guess the bottom line is, where are we headed? Why are we collecting all this information? Why are we putting it together and developing indicators? I think we've talked about with the whole indicators project, was it Cheerio, or what was it? Cheer. That we're trying to measure the community to see the health of the community, if you will, not just for health issues, but also for housing and some other qualities that.
We're going to go to General Mills for a Cheerio grant.
There you go. Great idea. Might even change the name and an organization. But this is a time of difficult budget for the city. And it's great to have community volunteers coming and working on a project like this. But I'd like to make sure that we're being effective and that we're ending up with something that's meaningful, other than just a report. So I'd like to hear what what's the bottom line? Where the rubber meets the road. What do we get out of this?
Well, I'll tell you what's happening. Just by the process of just starting to ask and look, people in our group became aware and started, and changes started happening immediately. The moment you start observing, the moment you start thinking about it, the moment you start thinking solutions and things start happening. And that's already happened within our group. People, as Ron mentioned, this has inspired him to take actions. And we attract, and the fact that we're doing this process is attracting the attention of lots of folks. We have had the partnership, the good partnership of Montgomery County Department of Housing and Community and Health and Human Services. They have a CHIP program, which is a community health improvement process. And they're using Tacoma Park because Tacoma Park has a living effort to look at us. Now they're making us the focus and for their CHIP process as the model to how to improve community information and how to focus service and how to improve the services in our area. That means we're first in line because we took the time to do this. We're also getting partnerships from other nonprofits. We've had discussions with the Primary Care Coalition, and I've had some discussions with other representatives from Washington Adventist Hospital who have been supportive. They want to help give us the information, develop the methodologies, and to help us figure out methods, the right methods, so that we get good baseline data, so we make more effective health choices, and that so that the clinics start operating more effectively and more efficiently in our area. And that's what we're doing, is leveraging resources into our community because we're doing this.
The bottom line is, and I don't mean to belittle the efforts that you all are doing, but we don't need more books on the shelf that have the data. We need programs that take that information and actually improve the community. And so I'd be interested any time that you're talking about what you've developed to give that slant to it of how does that benefit us? What is it that we're getting out of this? What is it that we can do with this data so that we do bring improvements to the community? Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming back again. I appreciate the work that you do. I'm particularly pleased to see the pieces about the proxy power and how you come up with the indicators. You thought tonight's council meeting was long. You should have sat through some of the council meetings on developing the strategic plan and all of the discussions along this panel about how important it is to be able to measure the impact of what we do. And our first round of the strategic plan was sort of really about most successful, I think, about getting the vision part of it out there. We listen to people. I listen to constituents all the time. I think I'm a pretty good representative of what the people in Ward 2 are interested in, and got that into a document. And then struggled through the pieces about finding ways to measure that, and what would be performance measures, and what would be outcome-based measures, and how much could we afford to spend on data. Several of us have worked in the federal government, or currently work in the federal government, and I think regularly think of a $1 million data project as not being that big of a deal. There's the $5 million moving to opportunity, but of course we don't have that, and so I appreciate a lot of the work that you've done, both around the housing indicators, around the health indicators, about the kinds of things that we can measure at a community level and that would be adequate for a community level. So I appreciate that, and I hope that we're able to look at some of these pieces where this fits into some of the livability components that we've identified in the strategic plan as things that we're interested in a community, as a community. But I'm also really, the strategic plan, we did it. It went on the shelf. The city manager utilizes it for us, I think, very well, and has the department heads are utilizing it. And when we get new items that come up, we're learning about how the things that the city's doing. I think the process we're in right now is learning about how the things that the city's doing sort of match into the strategic plan, and where maybe we didn't recognize everything about the city and need to adjust the strategic plan, and where we want the city to do other things. And that's kind of where we're at in the process now. So the document's there, and we're kind of working on it. And I think that we're doing a pretty good job with that, and one of the components that I think we need to do next is what you do, which is engage the community in the process. We talk a lot about engaging volunteers in the kind of work that we do that is important, and I think you've been successful at that, and I think also successful at accommodating diverse groups of people. You've hired a translator. I know when I worked on the housing group, there were a lot of different people that came. Your group is broader than Tacoma Park, which I think is okay, because we live in a community that's affected by those things that are going on around us. And so I guess what I'm kind of interested in a little bit moving forward is how the city could also learn from how you use your process of developing indicators and developing action plans to kind of better inform how we do that work around developing our strategic plans, and then how we engage the community in exercising those plans. And I'm always excited about participatory action and research, and so I like all the stuff that you're doing. So if you have anything to add about other things you think that you might bring back to us around those issues, I know Bruce, you and I have talked about that a little bit. I appreciate that as well, and I think it's a great contribution to us and to the community, and that's why I appreciate the work that you do.
I'd like to clarify the translators. They weren't hired. They were brought at no cost to the project.
I'm sorry, I wasn't specific. But the fact that they were there is what I appreciate.
There you go.
Down at this end, Councilmember Wright.
So kind of two lines of questions or thought. One is just would encourage you to take some of the lessons learned maybe that came out of the housing indicators, because I still feel like a level of, to be frank, disappointment around what came out of that, because, and I said this going into it, I was a little bit worried that you were going to come back and tell us stuff that the data was going to tell us stuff we already knew, and it wasn't really going to create any sort of actionable vehicle for us to change our policy or to think about doing something differently, or really be able to be used as a tool for us to advocate with others. So I think it's very important that, to Ron's point, like, you kind of know many of the issues. You see it every day. You know where the elements of the underserved are, and anecdotally what those needs are. So that the data does something more than just kind of prove what we already know, and is somehow more useful than that. And then the second thing is I don't quite get your theory of change. So I presume that there's some thought about, you sort of alluded to it, that you have this data, and then maybe that gets people energized. But is the theory of change around advocacy, or is it a community organizing model of theory of change? I think that needs to be thought out more, because we up here don't actually have the power or resources, probably, particularly when it comes to health. You could have argued with housing a little bit more. We could have an impact on housing. But, and I've said this before, related to the WA situation, it's not really the city's role or responsibility, I don't think, to be the main provider of health care, or really be that engaged in health issues. Like the level of the city government doesn't have the resources, and it's not the right level which in our state structure to really address those issues. And so, sure, we can listen to you guys and try and lobby with you, but at the end of the day, there's going to be power that needs to be developed to change something at a level, either at the county or the state level, probably. And so I would suggest, or I'd love to hear, what is the theory of change? And how do you see, I think to Terry's point about getting there to actually create that change. It's a little bit of a disconnect for me, or it's not crisp for me about the theory of change, social change.
Well, let me comment a little bit on that. This is a bottom-up approach, and our first objective isn't to change. It takes time to build up the power and the ability to change public policy at a high level. Mm-hmm. What we do is engage people in a process where they become conscious and aware of what's happening, and it's particularly useful in health circles. There are studies that show that the way that people's health improves is because the social networks they're in, there's some sort of tipping point, or that there's some sort of saturation of information in a social network, and then all the people in a social network suddenly start improving their behaviors, which is a key to changing. We're trying to, so the change isn't just changing the policy, it's also changing community residents' attitudes, their understanding, and how they interact to increase the amount of interaction, so they have more examples of and have more incentives to participate in more healthy behaviors, to be more physically active, to advocate for physical facilities in their neighborhood, stuff they might not do before. So it sort of percolates up over time, and when we get the data, which is we haven't got a data yet, we just selected the indicators. But when we get to the point where we have data, we'll have baselines, and we'll see how then that information becomes effective, and some of it becomes effective immediately. And of course, the first thing you find out is the things you already know. But but the things you find out later are things you never would have known. Indicators processes like these, it takes time for them to mature. The low-hanging fruit is the stuff you already know. But in a year or two, when you start collecting data and start having, when you have a group of participatory process where people are looking and say, why does that happen? Then also people start figuring out things that they didn't, that weren't apparent before. And then the policy implications become suggested, and more options, more informed options become available, and then the change takes off. In the research about community indicators processes in general, there's an understanding that it takes several years for the indicators to take hold, for them to mature to the point where they start really being effective as policy tools. It just takes that, But once you have that, they become one of the most effective ways of directing and creating positive social change.
So is the theory of change then that by just creating the indicators and having them exist, it creates that people become aware and then take action? And that action could be to change their own behavior, or it could be to try and change policy?
It could be to change policy, yeah. I mean, we have examples of both at the table right now. Clearly, one of the issues that came up, which is not a secret to anybody, is that healthcare access was a big concern. And we don't have the access we need. What we have now, though, is more stories about it and more concrete understanding, a better qualitative understanding of in what ways people aren't getting access. Everybody knows, there's a large percentage of people who have no health insurance. Well, they don't have health, but what we don't know is that a lot of people don't have access because there's cultural barriers, or language barriers, or that there's transportation barriers, and they exist in our community. Those details weren't necessarily apparent to everybody, and then as we become aware of them, we can address them.
I guess I would encourage you to think about power, because the world is littered with aware people, and it's also littered with great policy that never gets implemented. And so I think those two things, I don't think it quite gets you there to actually change what you're going to want to change. So I think there's got to be an overlay about power that you need to think about related to the project.
John, can I just say that I'm going to leave those intellectual discussions to brilliant guys like you. I'm more interested, and I don't really want to spring this onto my friends and colleagues, but if this was Wiley Inc., I'd go through this report and make a couple columns. And one of them would be what we know what the challenge is right now, clear and present, okay? And what we could do to structure some resources to do something about that. I wouldn't be personally hanging a lot of my time and energy on baselines, because I figure if I did something, I'd be moving the baseline along with it, okay? And I think that we should find a reasonable amount of time, here in terms of our colleagues, to come back and say, here's what we're putting together as a result of this in terms of action. I don't know whether that's 3 months, 6 months. I mean, I'm not here to make a point, except that I think we need an action agenda coming from this report.
And if I can just add to that, both of the times that we've come to you with things from CHEER, we've included a report. But this really isn't the main product of the process. The report isn't really the main product of the process. The group that formed and the people who make up that group are really the product of the process.
Yeah.
And that is what is going to carry forward what CHEER does. This is a tool that gets used. It's not the primary product. The other point I wanted to make, and I probably didn't address it completely before, but we looked at health in a very, very broad way, not just medical facilities. And there are aspects of that the city is very involved in. For example, physical fitness was one of the things that several of our group members were very interested in. And city recreational facilities were a big piece. I mean, does this community provide adequate facilities for people to maintain their physical fitness was an issue that came up. And obviously, in the immediate community, that's something that the city has a great deal to do with.
Yeah, I think I was going to agree with that the city has, I think one of you said you don't, but you do, because can families walk? You know, one of the things that I know that we encouraged just to get our parents reading is read to your kids 15 minutes every day, every night, no matter what language you speak. We just want you to read, communication. So one of the things from this is I'm going to say to families, take a walk with your kids every day. Well, some families can't walk in their neighborhoods. It's not well lit. It's not accessible to a park. So the city does have some control in that. We're talking about healthy lifestyle, healthy change. The city does have some impact on getting the word out. Hey, you know, who can you talk to get a farmer's market at Long Branch Recreation Center? So, there's a lot of things where the city and the community can come together and make a voice for people who can't.
Yeah.
We will do our best to empower them, but there's some things like lighting and things like that that the city does have control of.
Health is part of public work planning.
Yeah.
I'll try to keep it tight, but I've got a couple places I want to go. Bruce, I remember Tacoma 2010, where some of these ideas started out, and Kathy, you were on the council at that time. In fact, I still have that database, and it's still online with all of the stars and the priorities and things that came from outreach to all the wards in the city. And that was kind of the germination of this effort. You guys in the middle don't know that, but it was fun to do, and I'm really glad to see that it's come to this point. I'll get you the address of that database online so you can, for reminiscence sake. I have a couple of issues. The sense of partnership between the private sector and the public sector, between us and what people outside do, and I mentioned it in the comments, and I think it's really important for us to honor what you do in the public. We're all in the public before we get on the council and after we leave. And so I'll come back to thinking that we ought to have some marker about what percentage of our budget we push back into the community to fund and seed things, ideas like you have. When I'm thinking about our strategic plan, which is our guiding document, which others have mentioned, one of the things you mentioned here is responsiveness to needs, and then what you started with, some of the comments that you started with, particularly you, Dr. Wu, about the stories and listening to what people are really saying. It reminds me of a book I read about a month ago by a guy named Richard Rhodes about a criminologist named Lonnie Athens, and it was one of the best books I have ever read. And Lonnie Athens explained violence and rehabilitation and criminology, and he did that. He made some amazing breakthroughs by interviewing prisoners in jails to try to find out what they were thinking when they performed violent acts. He was not afraid to do that, and he was very good at it. And those interviews led to breakthroughs and understandings about motivations and processes, and in the end, stopping unhealthy trajectories that people get involved with. And so I'm hearing that you're interested in the stories that people have, and I'm hearing that you're starting to bring together some of those stories into a certain kind of baseline, which is not necessarily statistically based. And statistics are fine, but stories in a small context are very powerful. That book really brought that home to me. And a second point about our strategic plan is this notion of livability, which you also, I think, mentioned in this report. And that reminded me, as we were talking, as you were all talking about, the governor's happiness index. I don't know if you're aware of that. But as our economic system kind of stumbles a little bit, perhaps, in the state, the governor's office is doing a great deal of work to develop a new kind of index of well-being and growth. Not instead of state product, it's state happiness. And I mean, I'm not being facetious here. He's trying to recast what makes people satisfied and happy. And there is an enormous and well thought out and constructed website which has umpty-eight indicators of happiness, and you can go. I don't know the address of that particular website, but there's graphs pointing all different directions, and most of them are going up. In the governor's perspective, we're all getting happier every minute, even though the economy's before November and after. Yes, especially before November, and so. This kind of brings me to my third and final notion of livability. Well, did I say that? Responsiveness to needs, partnership, livability, and I'm wondering if there are linkages to our staff, and this is kind of where I know that is something that connects back between the private sector and the public sector, and
what can we and our staff learn from what you're doing, really learn to help us deliver the kinds of products and services that we need to do in this city. And so that's a challenge I'll give to you, to figure out how all the good works that you're doing can come back and infiltrate into our own staff perspectives and decisions. And I think that will be helpful. We had a housing discussion earlier. Some of you were lucky enough to be here, where we got very fine-grained on a few very specific items of how we treat people in our city as regards housing. And we do have a great deal of power in housing. We do not have a great deal of power in delivering health services, and yet I'm confident that the things that you bring to us, the stories or the baselines or whatever, can even help us deliver a healthier community through our staff if we listen hard to what you're saying. So with that, having blabbed, I don't have a particular challenge or question to you except to put that in your mind that all your good works, if they can improve city services, we will be all well served.
Councilmember Schultz.
I'm really impressed by this sense of working from the ground up, grassroots, or whatever you want to call it, because I think probably that's the way just about any significant change happens in our society. And the working group you have is about, what, 15 people that I see listed here on page 5, maybe give or take. And the theory is, as you expressed it, that the mere process is part of the product. That just by getting people involved and making them aware, they become conscious, they begin to see the world around them differently because they're looking at it from applying different criteria to what they see normally every day. It's like when you buy a new car, a new, say a Buick, just to be patriotic. All of a sudden you notice how many Buicks there are out on the highway. Oh, there goes another one, just like mine. So I see how that works, and that's cool. But, I mean, you've got a small group right now. I guess my thick question is how do you infect more people to get either people more directly involved in the cheer process, literally, just more people sitting around the table, but just more people becoming intrigued, interested, curious, and wanting to learn, and I mean, that process of spreading it out. Because, I mean, I'll give you an example before I'll let you answer. I mean, my wife is in the mental health business. She's been all of her life, and she counsels children. She's a play therapist, but and she mostly works with kids from about 4 to about 12. And she might have some interest in ideas that she could contribute. But on the other hand, we live in a community where there's lots of children that need this kind of help, but those children come from Spanish-speaking families. Well, neither one of us, we don't know any Spanish. So how do you provide mental health therapy, or in this case play therapy, because it's not verbal therapy so much, to children who don't speak any English? It's a frustration. But why should those children not have access to that kind of professional skill and help just because they have a different language that they speak at home? So that would be an example of how does a person like her, my wife in this case, but speaking hypothetically, become involved?
This is a participatory, community-based process. We have just formed the beginnings of our working group, and there will be opportunities as it continues, because this is just the first step. Second step is, there's also research. And there's some people who many of our group here are participating and helping to guide that research. That's going to also create opportunities for other people to get involved who may not have had an opportunity to work at this stage, to get involved at later stages. There may be ways in which we try to do observations or gather data within a community, surveying each other or making observations or something that would require people to contact other people. And it sort of gradually increases more and more people. We also have, within our group, we've discussed having community events or maybe presentations or ways that we can get the people in the community aware of some of the issues that are significant. And that's something we'll be discussing, and you'll probably see, not in the far distant future, probably pretty soon, an event that CHEER will sponsor that will bring the community in to discuss or to become more aware of some of the issues we're talking about. I can't tell you what it is right now because we haven't planned it, but that's definitely in the works. So it will just be a continual process, and the groups will grow. I mean, some people will come in. Some people will have other commitments and take. But over time, you're going to have a lot of exposure to a lot of people in the community, and it's going to be that way for each area which we do that. It's going to be the same for housing. It's going to be the same way we're just beginning a local economy indicators process, and that will be similar. So and all together, already, when we started, we had contact. Well, when we started, we had no contact with anybody. In a year, we've had substantive contact with about 140 people in the community. And I'd say that maybe next year that number will be double, maybe triple.
If I may just add to what Bruce said, in our case, any indicators that we discussed, we brought it back to the community members that we serve in Tacoma Park on Maple Avenue and shared that with them. And that was the same case with the housing issue also. We brought them to them, and then we told them what we're talking about it and what their input was. And so that was part of some of the things that we provided to Bruce. I also just want to talk about generally, if you look around in the nation, this community health indicators, or sometimes called community health assessment, it's something that is becoming a trend that the locals are relying less on a national or regional data, and they rather rely on data in their own communities. And I suppose council members want to know what's going on in Tacoma Park more so than what's going on in Garrett County or Howard County or something like that. You might want to know about that. But it does have its own value, and it not only does it create awareness in terms of the general public, but it also brings in community groups, organizations, and faith-based groups or other groups, brings them together to really come up with the solutions of how do you work on this together. If you look around how some of the nonprofit health centers in the communities started, like associations that have a community health center, it was started by citizens coming together and identifying what's the problems in their community to do something about it. So I personally have been involved in some of those community health assessments, for example, in the city of Alexandria, where it started in the health department. And that led to, partnership with the George Washington University School of Public Health, where the academic center would send advisors to help with the process, and partnership with the government sector to be part of it, so that it could be part of the students' work to do this project. And so, not just getting the numbers, but it also brings in community groups to really, like agencies, to look at what they're doing from a different perspectives. And so, that's what is a value about it. And instead of relying on the national or regional data, you have your own data to sort of tailor your services to that, and or even maybe improve it that way. You're welcome.
Thank you. This has been really fascinating, and I
particularly applaud the effort to bring such a wide diversity of people into the process, community groups and people themselves, because one of the things that, makes Tacoma Park in particular a successful place, I believe, is an active, involved citizenry, and people need to get involved through things that interest them. And so by going out to the groups who are working on, in this case, health, you did it with housing, it's a great way to help those people to foster that, those groups to continue their efforts and to work with you on them. And it also brings new people in who perhaps are just getting started, just getting their feet wet and so on. So I know we look forward to your next round of reports, and I can't resist putting in my plug, as has been put in, that the more specific, the better. I'll make one pitch. The Washington Council of Governments is I'm on one of the committees, a Health and Public Safety Committee, and one of our projects is to work on specific things to deal with obesity and fitness and wellness. And so there's a lot of emphasis on can we get kids to walk to school instead of taking buses if they live nearby, getting the cafeterias in school to change the menus to more healthy stuff. Can we get the staff of these organizations being more health aware? So some of the things you were talking about earlier fit right into this much wider Washington area thing. And of course, we now have the First Lady working on obesity. I think that's pretty cool too. And I had an opportunity to chat with Washington Adventist University and Adventist Healthcare about their plans for a wellness and fitness center. And while that's many years down the road, it does fit into this general thing. And it's one of the best things about having the Adventists in our community is that this is a huge focus of theirs, and we're glad to have it. So anyway, I look forward to your coming back with the next round. Thank you very much.
I'm putting the work group together on bicycle accidents.
Oh, yeah. Well, I could spend a lot of time on that.
Councilman Schultz, your wife can feel free to call me. I would love to use her service, and we can help her to translate. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you all.
Okay, our next work session item is proposed amendments to the Tacoma Park City Code, Chapter 16.04, Stormwater Management. And I see we have our Public Works Director here, Daryl Braithwaite.
I'm sure you've all had an opportunity to read through that 30-page document.
Well, there's a difference between reading through it and understanding all of it. That's, of course, crucial, too.
Sure, just some background.
I appreciate the color, by the way. That was helpful. Yeah.
Oh, is there? Oh, geez, she got a better version than I do. Just some background. State of Maryland passed the Stormwater Management Act of 2007, which hopefully will improve the impact on water resources from land development in the future. And part of its mandate was that it revised the model ordinance that the state provides for jurisdictions to meet the requirements of the law, and helps to set up a similarity among programs so that jurisdictions are asking for the same thing, requiring the same thing of developers, so that it reduces the likelihood of a very different type of development requirement, say if you're in Howard County than if you're in Anne Arundel County, or city to city. So it's trying to level the playing field, as it were, by establishing the model ordinance. The city's previous code, our Title 16 in the city code chapter for stormwater, was based on the last model ordinance that the state had put together. The one you have before you tonight is based on the revised model ordinance, and to say we follow it to the letter is not too far afield from reality. Our previous one was very close in language to the state's model ordinance, and so the draft you have before you tonight is similar to that. Some of the changes and the things that the state was trying to achieve with this recent improvement to the Stormwater Act is to integrate environmental site design to the maximum extent practical into the law. Now what that means is that environmental site design uses small-scale practices, non-structural techniques, and better site planning to mimic the natural hydrological characteristics. So basically it's trying to improve the way that buildings are built and oriented and how they interact with the existing environment, and to minimize the impact of the development on water resources. So the other critical factor of the new law is that environmental site design, any aspect or any way to use environmental site design has to be exhausted. You have to use all those methods that you can before you're allowed to implement a structural tool to meet your stormwater requirements. So what that translates into is before you put in a pipe, before you put in an inlet, you have to take a look at your building orientation, the permeability of your parking or your roof, natural swales within the land that you can mimic or enhance so that you're improving infiltration, you're slowing water runoff down, and you're basically trying to get water back into the ground, into the groundwater, versus running it off pavement into concrete pipes and out into the rivers and streams. Some of the other things is the techniques that are listed in the design manual that the state has as a resource tool for anybody doing planning or development is to conserve the natural features, the natural drainage patterns, and a big emphasis on conserving vegetation. Also, the goal is to minimize impervious surfaces to slow down runoff and to increase infiltration. Couple of things on a practical model. What you see in the draft ordinance we have in front of you was trying to achieve two things. One was to obviously update our code to meet the state's model ordinance. But the other thing was to clean up, and you'll see some of the changes are just language changes. The original ordinance was drafted at a time where the Public Works Department had Public Works managers versus directors. So some of the language changes were taking advantage of the opportunity, since we're changing the code anyway, just to update some of the language within the law. Another thing I think it's important to understand is in terms of what the city, what the impact on the city is of any stormwater ordinances. We receive probably 3 to 6 stormwater permits annually, so it's not a huge piece of what we do, but that they do exist, and they're largely commercial, the ones that we're receiving within the past few years. So that, that basically kind of paints the picture of how much of an impact this will be. Some of the other things that changes and changed from the previous ordinance to this one, there used to be a 2-stage process for permits. You had to do a concept plan, and then you had to do your final design plan. The state's now requiring a 3-step process, what it calls your concept plan, your site development plan, and your final permit plan. What we did for practical purposes, the state doesn't set the fees, we set the fees, but as you can probably recall, we spent some time taking a look at our fee structure in the past and tried to create one that we thought mimicked other jurisdictions and didn't put developers at a disadvantage or advantage one way or the other, tried to keep it fair and reasonable, also tried to provide some incentive. We didn't want to totally knock that out, so we basically used the same fee structure and split our 2-cost fee structure and just arbitrarily cut it in one of those in half to create the 3-set fee structure. You'll see that in the ordinance as well. We still have kept our criteria that requires the permits for residential development that affects more than 5,000 square feet and requires any institutional, commercial, or industrial application to receive a stormwater permit, regardless of the square footage affected or the development. So that was something that the council had selected to do a couple years back, and we've maintained that with the state's concurrence in the past, and we don't have any reason to believe that the state will have a problem with that. The state always allows...
What page is that on?
Page for the commercial, industrial, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to pull it off. It's hot.
Is that a definition, or is that just embedded in the text here in some way?
It comes across in the definitions as well as embedded in the text, and I can find that and can send you links to that. I don't remember right off the bat which part of the code that's in.
I didn't see it here in the, I saw the 40%, but I didn't see the industrial business. But I didn't read the whole thing.
You primarily will see it, I think, in the fee structure.
I see. That makes sense.
And I'm sure there's other areas as well. I'll just have to review it. The last piece that I wanted to point out, and this is again a change that was set by the state, is previously when you redeveloped a site, this state required a reduction in impervious area by 20%. They've increased that to 50%, so that's an across-the-board.
Increase in impervious?
Yeah, when you redevelop, in order to...
An increase in impervious?
Imperviousness. You have to have an existing site, and if you're redeveloping an existing site, which means it's got a building already on it, you used to have to reduce imperviousness by 20% from the actual conditions. Now you have to reduce imperviousness by 50%. Now, one of the effects of this will be that in terms of our incentive program that we tried to create previously by saying the city could rebate a percentage of your fee structure back to you if you exceeded our requirements, it now will make it very, very difficult, if not impossible, to exceed that kind of criteria, 50% reduction over existing imperviousness. May be achievable, but it's going to be a challenge, and I think across the state, everyone's looking at what this will mean in a practical sense. How reachable will these goals be? There's still criteria that allow for waivers and conditions to be set once someone, developer, can prove that they've exhausted all possible means for achieving the requirements. And they can also then go to structural techniques. If you can't do it with non-structural techniques, you have the ability.
Does that mean capturing water on a roof and putting it into a catchment basin?
Yeah.
I see.
Mm-hmm. So anyway, the process we have in front of us tonight is this is a general work session discussion. Anytime the city changes the code, it requires a 2-reading ordinance. So what we will be doing is going through this work session discussion and then having two other meetings following up. So there'll be plenty of opportunities to discuss the language. Another aspect of this is it needs to be implemented by May 4th of 2010. That's the state's requirement. The state also has to approve our ordinance changes. So we'll be sending them to the state for review, and don't anticipate any particular problems, again, because we followed the model so closely and had previously followed the model pretty closely. So there's nothing unusual about our approach. And so we probably would suggest that we go through a first reading process as it fits in with the council agenda, and we may want to either wait till we get state approval for the final second reading process, or we may want to go through second reading, and if for some reason the state wants us to change one thing or another, we'd have to bring it back in front of the council for an amendment to the code. So that's about all I have prepared-wise. The expertise and the depth of understanding on this particular code is with our city engineer. So any particular questions you have about that, I can get back the information from him to you all, or anything that would be helpful for you to have to better understand sort of the language of the code and the impact it'll have. We can get that information.
I have a quick process question. Have you had this reviewed by anyone, like developers or other folks, or?
No. We have had it, of course, reviewed by the city's attorney's office. We got the model ordinance, we drafted our version, we sent it to the city attorneys. They tweaked it a bit, cleaned up the language a bit. We have sent it to the task force and had a couple of just general discussions with them about it. So that's the review.
Development folks had a chance to take a look at it.
Planning office?
Yeah.
No, we haven't done anything formal with them. They don't review our stormwater permits. I mean, that's all handled by the city engineer, but.
No, I was more interested in if they had general comments from commercial developers about the current process or something like that as a way of.
Not that I'm aware of. I know in the planning community, there's been discussion on the state level about concern about grandfathering and concern about meeting the criteria, and some jurisdictions feeling that they're really could be hemmed in, that developers could have a very hard time meeting these requirements, and what the impact of that might be.
We had, I'll finish mine and then at one of the MML sessions, one of the communities that had a lot of rural area, had an urbanized area and rural area, had a lot of concerns. Tacoma Park doesn't fit that particularly, so I think it's going to be less of an issue. Okay, I'll give my council members a chance. Councilmember Robinson.
3 points. One is I'm a developer. I was a developer. I guess I'm still a developer, but not very active, having... Once a developer, always a developer. Once a developer, always...
No. Redeem yourself.
I spent all my money, so I'm not I don't know if I'm ever going to be a developer again. But on the redevelopment part, on page 5, it's interesting. It says exceeding, the old language was exceeding 5,000 square feet of land disturbance, and that's changed now to existing site impervious area exceeds 40%. And the plot of land which I developed was 5,500 square feet. And we carefully drew and said, well, we're only going to disturb 4,900 square feet. And yet the Public Works, the city engineer at the time, before him, said, nope, you're going to move more, that other 100 square feet, you'll disturb it somehow or another, so I'm going to make you're going to have to do a site thing. And it was fine. It was actually a good experience to go through that, probably in particular because we dealt with the city instead of the county, since the city has the responsibility to enforce stormwater. If it was at 40% now, it would have been clear that I was way, we were the impervious surface in that lot that I developed is far more than 40%. So that's quite a dramatic difference in a small lot. I don't know how it plays out in larger lots. Then you talked about patterns and natural designs and having to fulfill the requirements of the state, and that sounds pretty broad and sort of sweeping. And my question is, I'm a developer. I come back, and I'm trying to build my building. And how much more of a process is it this time around than what I went through before? What I went through before was my architect made some recommendations. The city staff went, yeah, that looks fine, and then off we went.
I think it'll be different now, especially given the emphasis on natural means versus structural solutions. I don't know the details on your plot as to whether or not a lot of structural solutions were part of the plan.
Here's kind of the essence of my question. Would you have design power to say, well, the building needs to shift that way?
I think that's part of why they have the 3-step process now, so that when you come in the door, your initial site, for your initial, I can't remember what they call it, concept plan, that's when those types of things would be discussed. Orientation, location.
Is that with your staff?
Yeah, that's with
Okay,
that's
because
with us.
there's also a site plan review with Park and Planning, and that has many similar processes. So I'm hoping that future developers, although we don't have that many open spaces in our city anymore, but there's a good stretch. My hope is that they won't have to go through, in essence, 2 site plan reviews, because one site plan review was excruciating in my case. It took many thousands of dollars and many months to get through Park and Planning, and my concern would be that having to go through 2 would be
awful.
Well, particularly if they're in conflict with one another.
Particularly if they're in conflict.
Yeah.
So that's a concern that I have, that time will tell, but it could get so oppressive that the developer would just throw his hands in the air and go, no, can do.
Yeah. I don't know that that's been an issue particularly that we've run across so far. I imagine it will be similar to what it has been in terms of that issue of county versus city authority on matters. The other point I wanted to make is that this isn't being done in a vacuum. The state has also developed this design manual, which is the Bible of everything stormwater and land development oriented. So an engineer or developer uses this manual that's got soup to nuts options for construction and land development, and also establishes the measuring tools and the criteria by which you can say this method equals this amount of water or calculations. So they've laid out the calculations, they've laid out the methods, and then the...
So you need an expert to interpret that. That's in essence like an architect. You need now a stormwater expert.
Engineer.
It's a new profession, it sounds like.
To be able to guide you through the design manual and select the right processes for your building.
Okay, and my third and final comment has to do with the third line on page 6, which describes a precipitation event. And don't you just really mean when it rains?
Third line on page...
Yes.
Yes, precipitation event,
Does that mean when
and you notice that's underlined
that originates,
language, so that's from the state.
Stormwater means water that originates from rain. Don't you really, isn't that what you mean? I mean,
that's what the state means, yeah, that's our language in the model ordinance, yeah.
so that's another little picky thing I got on that.
And I guess precipitation event could mean snow, hail, rain, any version of water. Frozen or unfrozen.
It's 5 after 11.
Outdoors. Anyone else?
Right.
My one comment, just very quickly, is that there's a couple different bills going on in the legislature that would modify or adjust the last stormwater bill. So just for us to check in with the lobbyists about whether they think any of those being passed are likely, and if so, how might that adjust this, just so we don't vote on something and then have to come back after legislative session and vote on it again. And the legislative session will close pretty soon, just before we have to have our thing in if it's in May. So maybe you already have that in the queue.
Councilmember Schultz?
Thank you. Couple questions. When we have a reading on this, we will be taking public testimony, as we would, normal course of procedure. Who would you think from the community would be interested in responding or commenting on this at that podium back there when we do this? I'm just kind of curious who on either side, whether they're in support of it or they're concerned about it.
I guess natural affinity would be anybody interested in water resources or land use or development on the pro side in terms of liking to see greater restriction in the way development occurs to protect water resources. And there are those groups within the city. It's hard to know whether folks that were considering a development process would come forth and talk about the impact, either financial from the permit structure or difficulty in terms of site design and planning and whatever new layers of complexity the ordinance will add to what they would normally have planned. That's a possibility as well. Anybody who's in the queue now is covered, providing they get their permit before May 4th.
I just was thinking that even to the extent that, say, a developer who was thinking of doing something would object. I mean, this is pretty much following the model ordinance. There isn't a whole lot that we or you is going to be able to bend on and say, oh, well, we'll just delete that whole section because then we want everything, get the thing approved by the state of Maryland. My second question has to do with sort of speculative also, and that is, in the sector plan, Tacoma Langley sector plan, you've got Walgreens, which bought up a huge chunk of land, is proposing to build a store there, do a good bit of demolition. And there's also room for a great deal of other kind of redevelopment. And that would be an area where this could have a tremendous effect. I'm not even characterizing it positively or negative, but would have, because that's practically half of Langley, that shopping area. The shopping areas are asphalt, miles, acres of parking. It's just going to be interesting to see how this would affect those kinds of developments.
We currently have a stormwater application in from one of the Walgreens-owned properties, and they're proposing a green roof as well as landscaping strips on an otherwise entirely impervious site. So I think already they're showing us there's ways that they can meet the requirements, but it will require a different way to do things. Lifting up pavement and having parking areas on structural soils that allow water to flow in, green roofs on the
grass
facility.
Yeah. That'll be exciting to see. It really will. I'll believe it when I see it, though.
Right.
One thing, a takeaway I took from the session I attended at MML was that manual we referred to is full of examples. I hate to say concrete examples, because it's a terrible pun, but in fact they're non-concrete examples of solutions to particular issues, like, so you have a large parking lot that you're going to have to redevelop, here's how to do it. And they have, in essence, people should be able to pull items from that and use them rather than having to, invent stuff whole cloth and then see if it gets approved. If they pull from that, they'll probably do pretty well. But it's going to be challenging.
Yes, I think it will be, and it'll be challenging for our engineer to evaluate those and determine if they agree with the calculations. I mean, as I mentioned before, not only does the design manual have options, but they also have the measuring tools, and there could be potentially engineers out into the future that will argue the measuring tools, but at least they've got down what everybody's using as the ruler. Whether or not that changes, that'll be the state's decision, but it makes any bureaucrat's job easier in that the way you measure or determine the calculation is spelled out just as the option is. So
they've done as good a job as they could.
I think so.
Any other questions? Thank you. We're adjourned.